Between two great rivers, in a land where the sun beats down upon endless plains and marshlands stretched toward distant mountains, there began the most extraordinary transformation in human history. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved their paths through what would become known as Mesopotamia, creating a fertile corridor between the harsh deserts of Arabia and the mountain ranges of Anatolia and Iran. These waters, born from mountain snows and ancient springs, carried with them the rich sediments that would nourish the first experiments in civilization. Long before the first cities rose from the alluvial soil, small bands of humans wandered these river valleys as their ancestors had done for countless generations. They followed the seasonal movements of gazelles and wild cattle, gathered pistachios and almonds from hillside groves, and harvested wild grains that grew in scattered patches across the landscape. These early peoples left few traces of their passing, save for the occasional stone tool dropped along a riverbank or the charred remains of a temporary campfire preserved beneath layers of wind-blown dust. The climate of this ancient land differed markedly from what we observe today. 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated northward, the region experienced more abundant rainfall and milder temperatures. Vast grasslands covered areas that would later become desert, while oak and pistachio forests clothed the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Wild cereals grew in such abundance that a family could harvest enough grain in 3 weeks to sustain themselves for an entire year. It was perhaps this natural bounty that first encouraged some groups to linger in favored locations rather than maintain their constant wandering. Along the flanks of the Zagros Mountains, in the hilly region where wild wheat and barley grew most prolifically, small communities began to establish seasonal camps. They returned year after year to the same rock shelters and caves, gradually accumulating knowledge about the rhythms of plant growth and animal behavior specific to each locale. The transition from mobile hunting and gathering to settled village life did not occur suddenly or uniformly across the region. Different groups experimented with varying degrees of sedentism, some maintaining their nomadic ways, while others began to invest more heavily in particular locations. At sites like Zawi Shemishanidar in northern Iraq, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of seasonal roundhouses dating to around 10,000 BCE, along with grinding stones used to process wild grains and the bones of sheep that may represent the earliest stages of animal management. One of the most significant early settlements emerged at Jarmo, perched on a hillside in the Kurdish mountains of northeastern Iraq. Around 7000 BCE, this small community of perhaps 150 people lived in rectangular mud brick houses with multiple rooms and courtyards. The residents of Jarmo cultivated emmer wheat and barley, though they still relied heavily on hunting wild game and gathering nuts and legumes from the surrounding countryside. Their tools reveal a sophisticated understanding of different stone types and their properties, with obsidian traded from sources hundreds of miles away used for the finest cutting implements. The people of Jarmo and similar early villages did not simply transplant wild plants into gardens. Through generations of selection, they gradually transformed the very nature of these species. Wild wheat and barley naturally possessed brittle rachees that caused ripe seeds to scatter with the slightest breeze, an adaptation that ensured the plants could propagate themselves. But this same characteristic made harvesting difficult for humans, as many seeds would be lost before they could be collected. By repeatedly planting seeds from plants with tougher rachees that held their seeds more firmly, early farmers unconsciously created new varieties that depended on human intervention for their reproduction. This process of domestication extended beyond plants to encompass the animal world. Sheep and goats, originally hunted for their meat and hides, began to be managed in small herds. The archaeological record shows a gradual shift in the age and sex profiles of animal bones found at settlement sites, indicating that humans were making deliberate choices about which animals to keep for breeding and which to slaughter for food. Over time, these managed populations developed physical characteristics that distinguished them from their wild ancestors, including changes in horn shape, coat color, and overall body size. The village of Tel es-Salwan, established around 6000 BCE along the eastern bank of the Tigris River, represents a more advanced stage of early agricultural society. Here, archaeologists have discovered elaborate irrigation channels that directed river water to cultivated fields, allowing farmers to extend the growing season and increase crop yields. The houses at Tel es-Salwan were larger and more complex than those at Jarmo, with some featuring buttressed walls and T-shaped layouts that may have served defensive purposes. Beneath the floors of these dwellings, the inhabitants buried their dead in stone-lined graves, often accompanied by elaborate grave goods including alabaster vessels and strings of carnelian beads. The material culture of these early farming communities reveals an explosion of creativity and technological innovation. Pottery, one of humanity's first synthetic materials, appeared in Mesopotamia around 7000 BCE. Early potters discovered that certain clays, when mixed with water and tempered with materials like straw or sand, could be shaped into vessels and hardened through controlled heating. These ceramic containers revolutionized food storage and preparation, allowing people to store surplus grain, ferment beverages, and cook foods in ways previously impossible. The decoration of pottery provides glimpses into the aesthetic sensibilities and perhaps the belief systems of these early peoples. Geometric patterns dominated with triangles, chevrons, and crosshatched designs painted in red and black pigments or incised into the clay before firing. Some vessels bore more naturalistic motifs, including stylized animals and human figures engaged in what appear to be ritual dances or communal activities. The similarity of decorative styles across widely separated sites suggests the existence of shared cultural traditions and regular interaction between communities. Stone tool technology also underwent significant refinement during this period. While earlier hunter-gatherers had relied primarily on chipped stone tools, the inhabitants of early agricultural villages developed a diverse toolkit that included ground stone implements, mortars and pestles for processing grain, polished axes for clearing land and working wood, and carefully shaped grinding stones became essential elements of daily life. The production of these tools required not only skill, but also considerable time investment, suggesting that some individuals may have begun to specialize in their manufacture. The social organization of these early villages remains largely mysterious, though certain patterns can be discerned from the archaeological evidence. Houses were generally similar in size and construction, implying a relatively egalitarian society without marked differences in wealth or status. However, some structures stand out as possible communal or ritual spaces. At sites like Çatalhöyük in neighboring Anatolia, which maintained close cultural connections with northern Mesopotamia, large buildings decorated with bull horns and geometric paintings may have served as gathering places for religious or social ceremonies. The management of agricultural surpluses presented new challenges that required innovative social solutions. Unlike mobile hunter-gatherers who could carry only essential possessions, settled farmers accumulated harvests that needed protection from both environmental threats and potential human raiders. Storage facilities evolved from simple pits lined with plaster or stone to elaborate granaries with multiple compartments and sophisticated ventilation systems. The construction and maintenance of these facilities, along with irrigation works and defensive structures, demanded coordinated labor that transcended individual household needs. Trade networks expanded dramatically as agricultural communities sought resources not available in their immediate vicinity. Obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Persian Gulf, and semi-precious stones from Iran circulated through increasingly complex exchange systems. These materials were not merely utilitarian, but often served social and symbolic functions. A necklace of imported beads or a blade napped from exotic obsidian might mark its owner as someone with far-reaching connections or special status within the community. The concentration of people in permanent settlements also fostered the development of new craft specializations. While every household likely produced its own basic pottery and tools, certain individuals began to excel in particular skills. The finest painted ceramics, the most symmetrical spindle whorls for textile production, and the most elaborate stone vessels increasingly came from the hands of specialists who could devote time to perfecting their craft. This nascent specialization would eventually evolve into the complex division of labor that characterized urban civilizations. Environmental management became increasingly sophisticated as communities grew larger and more permanent. Early farmers learned to read subtle signs in soil quality, water availability, and plant health that indicated when and where to cultivate different crops. They developed techniques for maintaining soil fertility, including crop rotation and the application of animal manure as fertilizer. The construction of terraces on hillsides and check dams in seasonal watercourses demonstrated an understanding of erosion control and water conservation that would prove essential as populations expanded. The spiritual life of these early agricultural communities appears to have been intimately connected with the cycles of planting and harvest, birth and death, abundance and scarcity. Female figurines with exaggerated sexual characteristics, often called mother goddesses, though their actual significance remains debated, have been found at numerous sites throughout the region. These may have been associated with fertility cults or ancestor veneration, or they might have served entirely different purposes we cannot now reconstruct. Clay tokens in various geometric shapes, found in large numbers at many sites, may have been used in divination rituals or as counting devices for keeping track of agricultural surpluses and trade goods. Tel Halaf culture, which flourished in northern Mesopotamia around 6000 BCE, produced some of the most distinctive pottery of the prehistoric period. Their ceramics featured complex polychrome designs with intricate patterns of flowers, birds, and geometric motifs painted in red, black, and white. The technical skill required to achieve these effects, including the ability to control firing temperatures precisely enough to preserve multiple colors, suggests the existence of specialized pottery workshops. Some vessels from this period are so finely made that they ring like bells when struck, indicating mastery of both materials and technique. The Ubaid period, beginning around 5500 BCE, marked a crucial transition toward more complex societies. Named after the site of Tel al-Ubaid in southern Iraq, this culture spread throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, reaching into Syria, southeastern Turkey, and southwestern Iran. Ubaid settlements grew larger than their predecessors, with some covering several hectares and housing populations of perhaps 1,000 people or more. These were no longer simple farming villages, but proto-urban centers with distinct neighborhoods, specialized craft quarters, and monumental public buildings. The most striking feature of Ubaid settlements was the appearance of temples as distinct architectural forms. At Eridu, considered by later Mesopotamians to be the first city created by the gods, archaeologists have excavated a sequence of temples spanning nearly 2,000 years. The earliest was a simple square room with an altar and offering table, but successive rebuildings created increasingly elaborate structures with multiple rooms, courtyards, and decorated facades. These temples were not merely places of worship, but economic centers that controlled agricultural land, managed long-distance trade, and redistributed resources among the community. The social implications of temple institutions were profound. For the first time, we see clear evidence of social hierarchy, with some individuals or families controlling greater resources than others. Elaborate burials with rich grave goods, including gold jewelry, carved stone vessels, and imported luxuries, indicate the emergence of elite groups. Large houses with multiple courtyards and storage facilities contrast sharply with smaller, simpler dwellings, suggesting significant disparities in wealth and status. The concentration of craft production around temple complexes implies that religious authorities may have controlled specialized manufacturing and trade. Irrigation agriculture expanded dramatically during the Ubaid period, particularly in southern Mesopotamia, where rainfall was insufficient for dry farming. Communities worked together to construct and maintain extensive canal systems that brought water from the rivers to fields sometimes located miles from natural watercourses. These irrigation works required not only initial construction, but constant maintenance to prevent silting and salt accumulation. The organization of such large-scale projects necessitated new forms of leadership and coordination, perhaps contributing to the development of more hierarchical political structures. The Ubaid period also witnessed significant technological innovations. The potter's wheel, one of humanity's first applications of rotary motion to manufacturing, appeared around 5000 BCE. This device allowed potters to produce vessels more quickly and with greater symmetry than hand-building techniques permitted. Metal working became more sophisticated, with copper tools and ornaments increasingly common. The lost wax casting technique, which enabled the production of complex metal objects, may have been invented during this period. Stamp seals, used to mark ownership or authenticate documents, became widespread, suggesting the development of private property concepts and administrative systems. Maritime technology advanced sufficiently to enable regular seafaring expeditions into the Persian Gulf. Ubaid pottery has been found at sites along the Arabian coast, indicating that Mesopotamian traders or colonists established outposts hundreds of miles from their homeland. These maritime ventures required not only seaworthy vessels, but also navigation skills and knowledge of seasonal wind patterns and currents. The bitumen used to waterproof boats and baskets came from natural seeps in the region, representing one of humanity's earliest uses of petroleum products. The artistic achievements of the Ubaid period reveal a sophisticated aesthetic sensibility and complex symbolic systems. Anthropomorphic figurines with elongated heads, coffee bean eyes, and elaborate hairstyles or headdresses have been interpreted as representations of deities, ancestors, or ritual participants. These distinctive figures, found throughout the Ubaid cultural sphere, suggest shared religious or mythological traditions. Painted pottery featured increasingly complex narratives, scenes, including processions of animals, dancers, and boats, possibly depicting mythological events or seasonal festivals. Settlement patterns during the Ubaid period show the beginning of urban planning principles that would characterize later Mesopotamian cities. Streets followed regular alignments, creating distinct neighborhoods and facilitating movement through increasingly dense settlements. Public spaces, including courtyards and plazas associated with temples, provided venues for communal activities and ceremonies. Defensive walls, though still relatively simple, began to enclose the most important settlements, indicating growing concerns about warfare and the protection of accumulated wealth. The environmental challenges faced by these early communities shaped many aspects of their social and technological development. The unpredictability of river flooding, which could bring either life-giving water or destructive inundation, fostered religious beliefs centered on appeasing capricious deities. The scarcity of building stone and timber in southern Mesopotamia led to innovations in mud brick architecture, including the development of arches and vaults that would influence construction techniques for millennia. The absence of metal ores necessitated extensive trade networks to obtain copper and tin, laying the groundwork for the commercial systems that would make Mesopotamia a hub of ancient international trade. As the 5th millennium BCE drew to a close, the foundations laid during the Ubaid period gave rise to something unprecedented in human history. The Sumerians, as they would later call themselves, emerged from the mixing of indigenous populations with possible migrants from the east or north, though their ultimate origins remain shrouded in mystery. Their language, unrelated to any other known tongue, suggests deep roots in the southern Mesopotamian landscape, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers approached the Persian Gulf through vast marshlands and fertile plains. The transformation from village to city accelerated dramatically around 4000 BCE, with the beginning of what archaeologists call the Uruk period. Named after the ancient city of Uruk, which would become the largest settlement the world had yet seen, this era witnessed innovations that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Where once stood clusters of mud brick houses surrounding modest temples, there now rose vast urban complexes housing tens of thousands of inhabitants engaged in an intricate web of specialized occupations. Uruk itself sprawled across nearly 6 square kilometers at its height, dwarfing any previous human settlement. Its population, estimated at perhaps 50,000 people, represented a concentration of human beings that required entirely new forms of social organization and resource management. The city was not simply a large village, but a qualitatively different type of community, where most inhabitants no longer directly produced their own food, but instead relied on complex systems of distribution and exchange. The urban landscape of Uruk revealed the profound changes occurring in Sumerian society. Massive temple complexes dominated the skyline, their white plastered walls gleaming in the harsh Mesopotamian sun. The Anu temple, dedicated to the sky god, sat atop a raised platform that elevated it 40 feet above the surrounding plain. The Eanna complex, sacred to Inanna, goddess of love and war, covered an area larger than many entire villages of earlier periods. These were not merely places of worship, but economic powerhouses that controlled vast agricultural estates, managed thousands of workers, and coordinated long-distance trade expeditions. Within these temple precincts, a revolution in information management was taking place. The complexity of temple economies, with their need to track offerings, rations, landholdings, and craft production, exceeded the capacity of human memory. Simple tokens and seals were no longer sufficient to record the multitude of transactions occurring daily. From this administrative necessity emerged one of humanity's most transformative inventions, writing. The earliest writing consisted of simple pictographs impressed into clay tablets with reed styluses. A circle with a cross might represent a sheep, wavy lines indicated water, and a triangular impression denoted a measure of grain. These signs were not yet true writing in the sense of representing spoken language, but rather served as memory aids for recording economic transactions. Temple administrators used these primitive notations to track the movement of goods, the assignment of workers to various tasks, and the distribution of rations to dependent personnel. Over several centuries, this pictographic system evolved into true writing capable of expressing abstract concepts and grammatical relationships. The transformation occurred gradually as scribes developed conventions for representing not just objects but actions, qualities, and eventually the sounds of spoken words. The pictograph for mouth combined with that for food came to mean to eat. The sign for arrow, which in Sumerian sounded like tai, could be used to represent the word for life, which was pronounced the same way. Through such visual puns and abstract associations, Sumerian scribes created a writing system capable of recording any thought that could be expressed in speech. The physical act of writing also evolved during this period. Rather than drawing pictographs with careful strokes, scribes began pressing the corner of their styluses into the clay to create wedge-shaped impressions. This cuneiform script, named from the Latin word for wedge, could be written more quickly than pictographs and was better suited to the clay medium. The standardization of sign forms and writing conventions allowed documents to be read by any trained scribe, facilitating administration and communication across the growing Sumerian city-states. The implications of writing extended far beyond administrative convenience. For the first time, human thoughts could be preserved across time and space, independent of living memory. Laws could be codified and consulted generations after their creation. Stories and songs could be recorded exactly as their authors intended, without the variations introduced by oral transmission. Knowledge could accumulate across generations, with each building upon the discoveries of their predecessors. The invention of writing marked the beginning of history in the truest sense, as humans began creating permanent records of their experiences and achievements. Eridu, located in the far south of Mesopotamia, near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf, held special significance in Sumerian consciousness as the first city established by the gods at the beginning of time. Archaeological excavations have revealed continuous occupation at the site for over 3,000 years, with the earliest levels dating back to the Ubaid period. The city's patron deity, Enki, god of wisdom and freshwater, was believed to dwell in the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth from which all springs and rivers emerged. The temple of Enki at Eridu, rebuilt numerous times over the millennia, became a pilgrimage destination and center of learning where priests preserved ancient wisdom and ritual knowledge. The city of Ur, situated northwest of Eridu, rose to prominence during the Uruk period as a center of trade and manufacturing. Its location near the confluence of ancient river channels and its proximity to the Persian Gulf made it an ideal hub for both riverine and maritime commerce. Merchants from Ur ventured as far as the Indus Valley, Oman, and Bahrain, trading Mesopotamian textiles and agricultural products for exotic goods like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and pearls. The city's craftsmen became renowned for their skill in metallurgy, producing elaborate gold and silver jewelry that adorned the temples and elite residences. The social structure of these early Sumerian cities reflected increasing complexity and stratification. At the apex stood the En, the high priest or priestess, who served as the earthly representative of the city's patron deity. This figure combined religious authority with temporal power, overseeing temple estates, directing public works projects, and leading the community in major festivals and rituals. Below the En, a hierarchy of priests and priestesses managed various aspects of temple operations, from conducting daily offerings to maintaining the sacred accounts. The Lugal, literally meaning big man, emerged as a secular counterpart to religious authority, particularly in times of warfare or crisis. Initially perhaps temporary war leaders chosen to coordinate defense against external threats, Lugals gradually accumulated permanent power and established dynastic succession. The relationship between religious and secular authority varied among cities and over time, sometimes cooperative but often competitive, as both institutions sought to control land, labor, and resources. Beneath these elite groups, Sumerian society encompassed a diverse array of occupations and social positions. Free citizens owned land, participated in community assemblies, and could engage in trade and crafts. Many worked as farmers on their own small plots while also fulfilling labor obligations to temples or palaces. Craftsmen organized themselves into professional groups, passing specialized knowledge from master to apprentice. Scribes, who underwent years of training to master the complex cuneiform script, formed a particularly important class, as literacy became essential for administrative and commercial success. The bottom tiers of society consisted of dependent workers and slaves. Temple and palace estates employed thousands of workers who received rations in exchange for their labor. These individuals, while not technically slaves, had limited freedom and remained tied to institutional employers. True slaves, often war captives or debtors, could be bought and sold as property, though Sumerian law codes provided certain protections and mechanisms for manumission. The distinction between various forms of dependent labor was not always clear, and individuals might move between categories depending on circumstances. Sumerian religious thought permeated every aspect of daily life, from the grand rituals performed in temple sanctuaries to the personal devotions of ordinary citizens. The Sumerians envisioned a cosmos populated by anthropomorphic deities who exhibited human emotions and desires while possessing superhuman powers. Each god and goddess controlled specific aspects of nature and human activity, requiring appropriate worship and offerings to ensure their continued favor. The pantheon reflected the Sumerian understanding of natural forces and social relationships, with deities of sky, earth, water, and fertility playing central roles. An, the Sky Father, reigned as the nominal head of the pantheon, though he remained somewhat aloof from human affairs. Enlil, god of wind and storms, exercised more direct authority as the king of gods who decreed the fates of cities and rulers. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, embodied both the creative and destructive aspects of sexuality and warfare. Her descent to the underworld, one of the earliest recorded myths, explored themes of death, renewal, and the cyclical nature of existence. Enki, the clever god of wisdom and crafts, often intervened on behalf of humanity, teaching the arts of civilization and occasionally thwarting the harsher decrees of his fellow deities. Religious practice centered on the daily care and feeding of divine statues housed within temple sanctuaries. These images, crafted from precious materials and adorned with elaborate garments and jewelry, were believed to be inhabited by the deities they represented. Priests performed elaborate rituals to awaken, dress, and feed the statues, presenting offerings of food, drink, and incense multiple times each day. Major festivals brought entire communities together for processions, feasts, and dramatic reenactments of mythological events. The New Year festival, celebrated at the spring equinox, involved the ritual marriage of the city's patron deity, ensuring fertility and abundance for the coming year. Personal piety found expression through votive offerings, prayers, and the commissioning of statue worshippers. These small figurines, placed in temples to pray perpetually on behalf of their donors, reflected the belief that constant devotion was necessary to maintain divine favor. Cylinder seals, rolled across clay to leave detailed impressions, often depicted their owners being presented to deities by protective spirits, illustrating the desire for divine intercession in daily affairs. Magic and divination provided additional means of understanding and influencing supernatural forces, with specialists interpreting dreams, examining animal entrails, and performing rituals to ward off demons and evil spirits. The Sumerians conceptualized the universe as a series of layered domains separated by solid boundaries. The Earth, a flat disk floating on the freshwater ocean of the Abzu, was covered by the dome of heaven, beyond which lay the realm of the gods. Beneath the Earth existed the netherworld, a dreary realm where the spirits of the dead dwelt in darkness, consuming dust and clay. This pessimistic view of the afterlife motivated the living to achieve remembrance through descendants and monuments rather than hoping for posthumous rewards. The construction of elaborate tombs and the provision of grave goods reflected the belief that the dead required material possessions in the underworld, though these items provided only modest comfort in that gloomy realm. The development of wheeled vehicles during the Uruk period revolutionized transportation and warfare. The earliest wheels were solid, wooden discs, sometimes composed of 3 planks joined together, attached to fixed axles that rotated with the wheels. These primitive vehicles, pulled by oxen or donkeys, moved slowly but could carry loads far exceeding human or animal pack capacity. The military applications of wheeled technology soon became apparent, with battle wagons providing mobile platforms for archers and serving as symbols of royal power. Chariots, lighter and faster than early wagons, would eventually transform warfare throughout the ancient world. The potter's wheel, already in use for ceramic production, underwent refinements that increased both the speed and quality of pottery manufacture. Fast wheels, powered by the potter's foot or an assistant, allowed for the creation of more symmetrical vessels with thinner walls. The standardization of vessel forms facilitated mass production, with workshops producing thousands of bowls, jars, and cups for institutional use. Decorative techniques expanded beyond painting to include impression, applique, and incision, with some vessels achieving artistic qualities that transcended their utilitarian functions. Metallurgy advanced significantly during this period, with bronze alloys becoming increasingly common. The addition of tin to copper created a material harder and more durable than either metal alone, suitable for both tools and weapons. The sources of tin remained distant and sometimes uncertain, necessitating extensive trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with regions as far away as Afghanistan and Cornwall. Gold and silver, worked into elaborate jewelry and ritual objects, served as markers of status and stores of wealth. The techniques of granulation, filigree, and cloisonné demonstrated mastery of metal working that would not be surpassed for millennia. Monumental architecture reached new heights of ambition and sophistication. The construction of temple platforms, the precursors to ziggurats, required the coordination of thousands of workers and the movement of millions of mud bricks. These artificial mountains, rising in stepped levels toward heaven, materialized Sumerian cosmology in architectural form. The White Temple at Uruk, built atop a platform 40 feet high, dominated the surrounding landscape and could be seen from miles away. Its elevation served both practical and symbolic purposes, protecting sacred spaces from flooding while bringing worshippers closer to the divine realm. Building techniques evolved to accommodate larger and more complex structures. The use of plano-convex bricks, flat on one side and curved on the other, created stronger walls capable of supporting greater heights. Bitumen mortar provided waterproofing for foundations and reservoirs. Reed matting laid between brick courses improved structural stability and prevented salt migration. The invention of the true arch, though not yet widely employed, pointed toward future architectural innovations. Drainage systems, including ceramic pipes and covered channels, managed rainwater and waste, essential for maintaining sanitary conditions in densely populated urban centers. The artistic achievements of Uruk period Sumerians extended beyond architecture to encompass sculpture, relief carving, and decorative arts. The Vaka vase, a 3-foot-tall alabaster vessel discovered at Uruk, depicts in carved relief the presentation of offerings to Inanna, providing insight into religious rituals and social hierarchies. The walk ahead, possibly representing Inanna herself, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and expression despite damage suffered over millennia. Cylinder seals became miniature masterpieces, their intricate scenes of mythology, ritual, and daily life revealing artistic skill and narrative complexity compressed into spaces smaller than a thumb. Trade networks expanded dramatically during the Uruk period, with Sumerian influence spreading throughout the Near East. Uruk colonies or trading posts appeared along the Euphrates into Syria and southeastern Turkey, identifiable by their distinctive pottery, architecture, and administrative practices. These outposts facilitated the acquisition of resources lacking in southern Mesopotamia, including timber, stone, and metals. The presence of Uruk material culture at sites hundreds of miles from the Mesopotamian heartland suggests not merely trade, but possibly colonization or cultural imperialism, as local populations adopted Sumerian technologies and organizational methods. The emergence of competing city-states created a dynamic political landscape characterized by alliance, rivalry, and occasional warfare. Each major city controlled surrounding agricultural land and smaller settlements, forming territorial units that prefigured later nation-states. Disputes over water rights, land boundaries, and trade routes generated conflicts recorded in later historical texts. The Sumerian king list, though compiled much later and mixing mythology with history, preserves memories of early dynasties and the shifting dominance among cities. Competition stimulated innovation as cities sought advantages through improved military technology, agricultural productivity, and administrative efficiency. The dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE found Sumerian civilization entering what historians would later call the early dynastic period, an era of both remarkable cultural achievement and intensifying rivalry among city-states. The foundations established during the Uruk period had solidified into distinct urban centers, each claiming divine sanction for its authority and competing for control over the limited agricultural land and water resources of southern Mesopotamia. This competition would drive innovation in governance, warfare, and culture, while simultaneously sowing the seeds of future conflicts that would reshape the political landscape. The city-states of this period functioned as independent entities, each maintaining its own government, military forces, and patron deities. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, and other major centers controlled territories extending beyond their urban cores to encompass agricultural districts, smaller towns, and pastoral lands. The boundaries between these territories remained fluid and contested, with disputes over field boundaries and irrigation rights frequently escalating into armed conflicts. These wars, though limited in scale compared to later imperial conquests, profoundly influenced Sumerian society, strengthening the position of military leaders and necessitating increasingly sophisticated defensive fortifications. The figure of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, sometime around 2700 BCE, exemplifies the transformation of historical rulers into legendary heroes. While Gilgamesh appears to have been an actual king whose reign was remembered for the construction of Uruk's massive walls, his story evolved over centuries into the first great epic of world literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though compiled in its full form much later, preserves Sumerian traditions about divine kingship, heroic adventure, and the human confrontation with mortality. The tale of Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu wrestling with questions of friendship, loss, and the meaning of life resonated across cultures and millennia, establishing narrative patterns that would influence literature from ancient Greece to modern times. The historical Gilgamesh ruled during a period when kingship was becoming increasingly institutionalized. The Sumerian king list, despite its mythological elements and propagandistic purposes, provides glimpses into how Sumerians understood their political history. According to this document, kingship descended from heaven and moved among cities according to divine will, with each dynasty ruling until the gods decreed its transfer to another city. This ideological framework legitimized both the authority of current rulers and the possibility of political change, creating a system where military victory could be interpreted as divine approval. Archaeological evidence from early dynastic royal tombs reveals the extraordinary wealth and power accumulated by Sumerian elites. The royal cemetery at Ur, dating to approximately 2500 BCE, contained burials of unprecedented elaboration. The tomb of Queen Puabi included not only spectacular jewelry crafted from gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, but also the bodies of dozens of attendants who accompanied their mistress into the afterlife. These retainers, apparently killed or willing participants in ritual suicide, were arranged in orderly rows wearing their finest garments and holding musical instruments or weapons. Such elaborate funeral practices demonstrated both the enormous resources controlled by rulers and the ideology of divine kingship that justified such extreme expressions of loyalty. The artifacts recovered from these royal tombs showcase the pinnacle of Sumerian craftsmanship. The golden bull's head decorating Queen Puabi's lyre, with its lapis lazuli beard and shell-inlaid eyes, achieves a naturalism and emotional power that transcends its decorative function. Elaborate headdresses incorporating hundreds of gold leaves and semi-precious stones would have transformed their wearers into glittering embodiments of divine favor. Gaming boards inlaid with complex geometric patterns suggest leisure activities of considerable sophistication, while weapons decorated with precious materials indicate that even instruments of war served as symbols of status and divine authority. Warfare during the early dynastic period underwent significant technological and tactical evolution. The stele of the vultures, commemorating a victory of Lagash over Umma around 2450 BCE, depicts soldiers advancing in tight formations behind rectangular shields, presenting a wall of protection against enemy projectiles. This phalanx formation, with spearmen arranged in multiple ranks, represented a major tactical innovation that would influence military practice throughout the ancient world. Bronze weapons became increasingly common, with socketed spearheads and axes providing superior penetration against armor. The composite bow, constructed from wood, horn, and sinew, delivered arrows with greater force and accuracy than simple self-bows, though its complexity limited widespread adoption. The intensification of warfare necessitated advances in defensive architecture. City walls grew higher and thicker, incorporating projecting towers that allowed defenders to attack besiegers from multiple angles. Gates became elaborate defensive complexes with multiple chambers, forcing attackers to navigate a series of confined spaces where they could be targeted from above. Moats and glacis further complicated assault attempts, while internal citadels provided final refuges for elite populations. The resources required for such constructions demonstrate both the wealth of Sumerian cities and the constant threat of military conflict. Economic life during the early dynastic period achieved new levels of complexity and sophistication. Temple estates and palace holdings encompassed thousands of acres, worked by dependent laborers and sharecropping farmers. These institutions maintained detailed records of agricultural production, tracking everything from seed distribution to harvest yields. Ration lists reveal standardized distributions of barley, oil, and wool to different categories of workers, with skilled craftsmen and administrators receiving larger allotments than field laborers. The emergence of silver as a standard of value, though not yet coined money, facilitated long-distance trade and the accumulation of transferable wealth. Private economic activity flourished alongside institutional enterprises. Merchants organized trading ventures, pooling resources to finance caravan expeditions and sharing both risks and profits. Legal documents record sales of houses, fields, and orchards, indicating active real estate markets. Contracts for loans, partnerships, and apprenticeships demonstrate sophisticated understanding of financial arrangements. The charging of interest on loans, typically 20 to 33% annually, suggests capital was scarce relative to investment opportunities. Professional groups of craftsmen maintained quality standards and trained apprentices, creating early forms of guild organization. The city of Lagash provides particularly rich documentation of early dynastic society through the archives of its rulers and temples. Under the leadership of Ur-Nanshe around 2500 BCE, Lagash emerged as a major regional power, controlling extensive agricultural territories and maintaining active trade connections throughout the Near East. Ur-Nanshe's inscriptions emphasize his piety and building activities, claiming divine approval for his rule through the construction of temples and the excavation of canals. His dynasty would rule Lagash for several generations, each ruler adding to the city's monuments and expanding its territorial control. The conflict between Lagash and neighboring Umma over the Gwedena, a fertile district along their mutual border, exemplifies the endemic warfare of the period. This dispute, lasting over a century, generated numerous inscriptions and monuments as each side sought to justify its claims through appeals to divine authority and historical precedent. The border was demarcated and re-demarcated multiple times, with stone monuments erected to mark boundaries and record treaty terms. The repeated violation of these agreements demonstrates both the value of agricultural land and the difficulty of maintaining peaceful relations among competing city-states. Eannatum, ruler of Lagash around 2450 BCE, achieved temporary hegemony over much of Sumer through military conquest. His victory stele, known as the Stele of the Vultures from its depiction of birds carrying away enemy dead, presents both mythological and historical accounts of his triumph over Umma. The monument shows the god Ningirsu capturing enemies in a net, while Eannatum leads his phalanx into battle, illustrating the intertwining of divine and human agency in Sumerian ideology. Eannatum's claims to have conquered Uruk, Ur, and other major cities, though possibly exaggerated, indicate the potential for ambitious rulers to extend authority beyond their traditional territories. The emergence of law codes during this period represents a crucial development in the administration of justice and the regulation of social relations. Although the famous Code of Hammurabi dates to a later period, early dynastic rulers were already promulgating legal reforms and standardized penalties. Uruk and Ur of Lagash, ruling around 2350 BCE, issued decrees protecting widows and orphans from exploitation, limiting the power of temple administrators and reducing various taxes and fees. His reforms, presented as a restoration of ancient customs rather than innovations, suggest ongoing tensions between different social groups and the need for royal intervention to maintain social harmony. Legal documents from this period reveal a sophisticated system of courts and legal procedures. Contracts required witnesses and often invoked divine curses against violators. Judges drawn from temple personnel or respected citizens heard cases involving property disputes, inheritance claims, and criminal accusations. Penalties ranged from fines and compensation to physical punishment and execution. The principle of proportional justice, later codified as an eye for an eye, already influenced legal thinking, though monetary compensation often substituted for physical retaliation. The recording of legal precedents and the development of legal formulas standardized judicial proceedings and reduced arbitrary decision-making. Mathematical knowledge advanced significantly during the early dynastic period, driven by practical needs of administration, construction, and trade. Sumerian mathematics employed a sexagesimal system based on the number 60, a choice that facilitated calculations involving fractions and astronomical observations. This system survives today in our division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Scribal schools taught students to solve complex problems involving area, volume, and proportions. Mathematical tablets demonstrate understanding of geometric relationships, including approximate values for pi and methods for calculating the areas of irregular fields. Astronomical observations became increasingly systematic as priests tracked celestial movements to maintain accurate calendars and predict astronomical events. The Sumerian calendar consisted of 12 lunar months, requiring periodic insertion of intercalary months to maintain alignment with the solar year. Each city-state initially maintained its own calendar with different month names and New Year observations, complicating inter-city coordination. Astronomers identified the major planets which they associated with important deities and tracked their movements through the zodiacal constellations. These observations laid the foundation for later Babylonian astronomy and ultimately influenced Greek and Islamic astronomical traditions. The Sumerian Renaissance under Gudea of Lagash around 2144 BCE represents a final flowering of Sumerian culture before the rise of Semitic dynasties. Although technically belonging to a slightly later period, Gudea's reign exemplifies the cultural achievements possible under enlightened leadership. His numerous statue inscriptions, written in elegant Sumerian, describe extensive building projects, including the reconstruction of the Ininnu temple complex dedicated to Ningirsu. These texts provide detailed information about construction techniques, materials acquisition, and religious ceremonies, offering unparalleled insights into Sumerian architecture and ritual practice. Gudea's statues, carved from diorite imported from distant lands, achieve a naturalism and serenity that rank among the finest sculptures of the ancient world. The ruler appears in a posture of pious devotion, his hands clasped in prayer, wearing a simple cap and flowing garment. Inscriptions covering the statue's surfaces describe Gudea's divine commission to rebuild temples, his acquisition of materials from throughout the known world, and his dedication to justice and prosperity. The emphasis on peaceful achievements rather than military conquest may reflect political weakness, as Lagash operated under the shadow of Gutian domination, but it also demonstrates alternative models of legitimate rulership. The inscriptions of Gudea preserve invaluable information about Sumerian trade networks and resource acquisition. Cedar beams came from the mountains of Lebanon, stone from the quarries of Arabia, gold from the mountains of Armenia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. This extensive trade required not only economic resources but also diplomatic relationships and secure transportation routes. The ability to acquire materials from such distant sources demonstrates the continued vitality of Sumerian civilization despite political fragmentation and foreign domination. Irrigation systems reached new levels of sophistication during the early dynastic period, with major canals extending for dozens of miles and secondary channels creating intricate networks of water distribution. The construction and maintenance of these systems required cooperation among multiple communities and sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering. Regulators controlled water flow, while storage basins captured floodwaters for use during dry seasons. The accumulation of salt in irrigated soils, a long-term consequence of intensive agriculture, began to reduce productivity in some areas, forcing the abandonment of fields and contributing to shifts in political power. The role of women in early dynastic society, though constrained by patriarchal norms, included significant economic and religious functions. Priestesses managed temple estates and conducted important rituals, with some achieving high status and considerable autonomy. The end priestess of the moon god at Ur traditionally came from the royal family and controlled extensive properties. Women engaged in textile production, both as independent weavers and within institutional workshops. Legal documents show women buying and selling property, operating businesses, and initiating legal proceedings. The wives and daughters of rulers participated in diplomatic marriages that cemented political alliances, sometimes wielding considerable influence in their adoptive cities. Education during this period remained primarily the preserve of elites and professional scribes, though literacy may have been more widespread than often assumed. Scribal schools, called tablet houses, taught students to read and write cuneiform through copying standard texts and practicing mathematical problems. The curriculum included Sumerian grammar, even as Akkadian became increasingly common as a spoken language, preserving the classical language for religious and literary purposes. Advanced students studied literature including myths, hymns, and wisdom texts that transmitted cultural values and historical traditions. The production of lexical lists, organizing words by semantic categories, demonstrates systematic approaches to knowledge organization that would influence later scholarship. Craft specialization reached new heights of sophistication, with distinct workshops producing goods for local consumption and long-distance trade. Textile production employed thousands of workers, primarily women, who spun thread, wove cloth, and created elaborate garments. Mesopotamian textiles gained fame throughout the ancient world for their quality and decorative patterns. Metal workers produced tools, weapons, and luxury items using increasingly complex techniques including lost wax casting, granulation, and inlay work. Pottery workshops mass-produced utilitarian vessels while also creating elaborate ceremonial pieces. Stone carvers, leather workers, basket makers, and other specialists contributed to an economy of unprecedented diversity and complexity. Religious architecture evolved beyond simple temples to encompass vast sacred complexes including multiple shrines, administrative buildings, workshops, and storage facilities. The development of the ziggurat form, with its stepped levels ascending toward heaven, created artificial mountains in the flat Mesopotamian landscape. These structures required millions of bricks and decades of construction, demonstrating both engineering capability and the ability to mobilize resources for religious purposes. Temple complexes became cities within cities, employing thousands of personnel in roles ranging from high priests to sweepers, musicians to accountants. The development of cylinder seals as personal identifiers and artistic expressions reached its apogee during the early dynastic period. These small stone cylinders, carved with intricate scenes and inscriptions, served as signatures when rolled across clay tablets or jar ceilings. The scenes depicted on seals provide windows into Sumerian mythology, showing gods and heroes engaged in cosmic battles, ritual performances, and divine banquets. Contest scenes featuring heroes subduing lions or bulls may represent the eternal struggle between civilization and chaos. The technical skill required to carve detailed scenes on cylinders, sometimes less than an inch tall, demonstrates remarkable artistic achievement. Musical traditions flourished in both sacred and secular contexts, with professional musicians maintaining positions in temples and palaces. Harps, lyres, drums, and wind instruments accompanied religious ceremonies, royal banquets, and public festivals. The discovery of musical instruments in royal tombs, including elaborately decorated lyres and harps, indicates the high status accorded to music. Sumerian hymns preserved in cuneiform tablets reveal sophisticated poetic structures with repetition, parallelism, and elaborate metaphors. These compositions influenced later Mesopotamian literature and possibly contributed to biblical psalms through cultural transmission. The concept of divine kingship evolved to encompass not just military leadership and religious authority, but also responsibility for social justice and economic prosperity. Kings presented themselves as shepherds of their people, chosen by the gods to maintain order and abundance. Royal inscriptions emphasized the construction of temples and canals, the establishment of justice, and the protection of the weak. This ideology of benevolent kingship, though often contradicted by political reality, established standards against which rulers would be judged and remembered. The tension between ideal and reality generated both propaganda extolling royal virtues and wisdom literature warning against the abuse of power. The political landscape of Mesopotamia underwent a revolutionary transformation around 2334 BCE, when a figure of obscure origins rose to create the world's first multi-ethnic empire. Sargon of Akkad, whose name means legitimate king, suggesting it was adopted rather than given at birth, emerged from the northern regions where Semitic-speaking peoples had long coexisted with Sumerian city-states. His capital, Akkad, somewhere along the Euphrates north of Sumer, would lend its name to both an empire and the Semitic language that would gradually displace Sumerian as the spoken tongue of Mesopotamia. Legend shrouded Sargon's early life in mystery and divine providence, with later texts claiming his mother was a priestess who set him adrift in a basket sealed with bitumen, prefiguring the biblical story of Moses. Whether born to humble circumstances or crafted as propaganda to emphasize his meritocratic rise, Sargon began his career as cupbearer to the king of Kish, a position of intimate access to power. When Lugal-Zaggesi of Umma conquered Kish and claimed dominion over Sumer, Sargon rallied the northern cities in rebellion, demonstrating military genius that would reshape the ancient world. The Akkadian military machine that Sargon created differed markedly from the traditional Sumerian phalanxes. His soldiers, recruited from semi-nomadic populations accustomed to mobility and hardship, excelled at rapid movement and flexible tactics. Armed with composite bows and bronze weapons, they could strike quickly and retreat before enemies organized their defenses. Sargon's emphasis on professional soldiers rather than citizen militias created an army loyal to him personally rather than to particular cities, enabling campaigns of unprecedented scope and duration. His conquest of Sumer proceeded with remarkable efficiency as Sargon defeated Lugalzagizi and systematically subdued each major city-state. Unlike previous conquerors who might exact tribute and withdraw, Sargon established permanent garrisons and appointed governors, often Akkadians, to administer conquered territories. The walls of defeated cities were dismantled to prevent rebellion, while their religious institutions were co-opted rather than destroyed. Sargon showed particular reverence for Sumerian deities, appointing his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god at Ur, a position that would traditionally be held by Sumerian royalty. Enheduanna herself became a remarkable figure in world literature, the first named author in history whose works survive. Her hymns to Inanna, composed in eloquent Sumerian despite her Akkadian heritage, demonstrated the cultural synthesis Sargon promoted. Through her religious poetry, she wove together Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, identifying the Sumerian Inanna with the Semitic Ishtar and creating theological frameworks that would endure for millennia. Her personal devotions, expressing both religious ecstasy and political anxieties during a rebellion against her father's authority, provide intimate glimpses into the challenges of maintaining imperial control. Sargon's ambitions extended far beyond Mesopotamia proper, as he led expeditions to the Mediterranean coast, into Anatolia, and perhaps as far as Cyprus and Crete. His inscriptions claim he washed his weapons in the upper and lower seas, referring to the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf, establishing the ideological boundaries that future Mesopotamian empires would seek to match. These campaigns were not merely raids for plunder, but attempts to control trade routes and resource extraction, particularly the silver mines of Anatolia and the cedar forests of Lebanon. The administration of this vast territory required innovations in governance that moved beyond the city-state model. Akkadian became the language of administration throughout the empire, though Sumerian remained important for religious and literary purposes. Standardized weights and measures facilitated trade and taxation across diverse regions. The calendar was reformed to create imperial consistency, while royal agents traveled regular circuits to collect taxes, adjudicate disputes, and maintain central authority. This administrative apparatus, though rudimentary compared to later empires, established patterns of imperial governance that would influence subsequent states. Economic integration accompanied political unification, as Sargon's empire created a vast free trade zone where merchants could travel safely under imperial protection. Akkadian merchants established trading colonies from the Indus Valley to Anatolia, creating networks that moved not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic styles. The wealth flowing to Akkad financed monumental construction projects and supported a flowering of arts and literature. Akkadian sculpture achieved new heights of naturalism, with royal portraits conveying individual personality rather than idealized types. The bronze head discovered at Nineveh, believed by many to represent Sargon himself, exemplifies Akkadian artistic achievement. The portrait captures not just physical features but a sense of regal authority and personal charisma, with carefully rendered beard, penetrating eyes, and an elaborate hairstyle suggesting both Sumerian and Semitic influences. The damage to the piece, particularly the gouged eyes and missing inlays, may reflect deliberate mutilation during later rebellions, indicating the powerful emotions that imperial rule could provoke. Sargon's death, after a reign of 56 years, left an empire held together largely by his personal prestige and military reputation. His son Rimush inherited a realm seething with rebellion as Sumerian cities sought to reclaim independence and rival Akkadian generals challenged royal authority. Rimush suppressed these revolts with extreme brutality, his inscriptions boasting of thousands killed and enslaved. Yet violence alone could not maintain imperial cohesion, and Rimush fell to a palace conspiracy, possibly orchestrated by his own brother Manishtushu. The reign of Manishtushu saw consolidation rather than expansion, as the empire focused on economic development, and administrative refinement. His most famous monument, the obelisk of Manishtushu, records extensive land purchases that consolidated royal estates, demonstrating how Akkadian rulers sought to create economic foundations for their power beyond military conquest. Maritime expeditions to the lands of the Persian Gulf brought exotic stones and metals, while diplomatic missions established peaceful relations with distant powers. Yet Manishtushu too died violently, suggesting persistent instability within the Akkadian elite. The accession of Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, marked both the apex and the beginning of decline for the Akkadian Empire. His reign of 36 years witnessed military victories that surpassed even Sargon's achievements, cultural developments that synthesized Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, and ultimately the hubris that would contribute to imperial collapse. Naram-Sin's victory stele, one of the masterpieces of ancient art, depicts him ascending a mountain path while enemies fall beneath his feet, the horned helmet of divinity upon his head, and celestial symbols approving his triumph. This assumption of divine status represented a radical departure from traditional Mesopotamian kingship. Where previous rulers served as representatives of the gods, Naram-Sin declared himself a god, demanding temples and worship in his own right. His name was written with the divine determinative, and oath formulas invoked him alongside traditional deities. This deification may have been an attempt to transcend ethnic and religious divisions within the empire, creating a focus of loyalty that superseded local traditions. Yet it also provoked resistance from religious conservatives and contributed to his demonization in later literature. The Great Revolt, early in Naram-Sin's reign, tested the empire's survival as numerous cities rose simultaneously against Akkadian rule. The rebellion's coordination suggests widespread planning and communication among disparate groups united primarily by opposition to imperial authority. Naram-Sin's successful suppression of this revolt, commemorated in numerous inscriptions and artistic works, demonstrated both military skill and strategic patience. Rather than rushing to confront all enemies simultaneously, he defeated them piecemeal, using the empire's superior logistics and professional army to concentrate force against isolated opponents. Military innovations under Naram-Sin included the development of siege warfare techniques that could reduce even well-fortified cities. Siege towers, battering rams, and undermining operations supplemented traditional blockade tactics. The integration of different military traditions, combining Sumerian heavy infantry, Akkadian archers, and auxiliary forces from conquered regions, created combined arms tactics of considerable sophistication. Mountain warfare in the Zagros and Taurus ranges required new approaches to logistics and combat, with Akkadian forces learning to operate in terrain vastly different from the Mesopotamian plains. The empire's territorial extent under Naram-Sin exceeded all previous bounds, reaching into the Iranian plateau, the Levantine coast, and deep into Anatolia. Rock reliefs carved in distant mountains proclaimed Akkadian power to local populations, while fortified outposts protected trade routes and resource extraction sites. The conquest of Magan, probably corresponding to Oman, secured copper sources essential for bronze production. Control of Meluha trade, connecting to the Indus Valley civilization, brought exotic goods and cultural exchanges that enriched Mesopotamian society. Yet this vast empire contained the seeds of its own destruction as administrative capacity struggled to match territorial ambition. Local rebellions became endemic, requiring constant military campaigns that drained resources and prevented consolidation. Environmental factors, particularly a severe drought that affected much of the Near East around 2200 BCE, stressed agricultural production and urban populations. The Gutians, mountain peoples from the Zagros whom Mesopotamian sources portrayed as barbarians, began raiding imperial territories with increasing boldness. The cultural achievements of the Akkadian period transcended political vicissitudes, creating syntheses that would define Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. Bilingualism became standard among educated elites, with scribes trained in both Sumerian and Akkadian, creating sophisticated translations and bilingual compositions. Literary works combined mythological traditions from both cultures, weaving new narratives that reflected imperial cosmopolitanism. The Sumerian pantheon absorbed Semitic deities, while Akkadian religious practice adopted Sumerian rituals, creating a syncretic religious system. Cylinder seals from the Akkadian period display remarkable artistic innovation, with mythological scenes rendered in unprecedented detail and dynamism. The combat between gods and monsters, the presentation of captives to deities, and the ascent of the sun god from the eastern mountains were depicted with a naturalism and emotional intensity absent from earlier Sumerian art. These miniature masterpieces, requiring extraordinary skill to carve, served not just administrative functions but also as portable art objects that spread Akkadian aesthetic influence throughout the empire. The collapse of Akkadian power occurred with stunning rapidity in the late 3rd millennium BCE. Shah Kali-Shari, son of Naram-Sin, inherited an empire already fragmenting under pressure from external invasions and internal rebellions. His inscriptions, unlike the boastful proclamations of his predecessors, record desperate defensive battles against enemies pressing from all directions. The Gutians overran Mesopotamia proper, while Hurrians pressed from the north and Elamites from the east. City-states reasserted independence, with local dynasties claiming divine sanction for their autonomy. The Gutian period, lasting roughly a century, remains poorly documented, as these mountain peoples left few inscriptions and may have ruled indirectly through local vassals. Mesopotamian sources, written by their enemies and successors, portrayed the Gutians as ignorant barbarians who destroyed temples and disrupted religious festivals. Yet some cities, particularly in the south, maintained considerable autonomy and even prosperity during this period. Lagash, under its Ensi Gudea, experienced a cultural renaissance, suggesting that Gutian rule, however resented, did not entirely suppress Mesopotamian civilization. The liberation from Gutian domination came from an unexpected source, as Utu-Hagal of Uruk rallied Sumerian cities in a successful rebellion around 2100 BCE. His victory inscription presents the conflict in cosmic terms, with the god Enlil commissioning him to restore proper divine order by expelling the mountain demons. Yet Utu-Hagal's triumph proved ephemeral, as he died under mysterious circumstances after only 7 years, possibly overthrown by his own general Ur-Nammu, who established a new dynasty at Ur. The third dynasty of Ur, known as Ur III, represented the final flowering of Sumerian political power. Though paradoxically its administrative language was increasingly Akkadian, Ur-Nammu and his successors created a centralized state that surpassed even the Akkadian Empire in bureaucratic sophistication. Where Sargon and his heirs had ruled through military force and personal charisma, the Three Kings governed through systematic administration that documented every aspect of economic and social life. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the earliest known law code, predated Hammurabi's more famous compilation by 3 centuries. Its provisions reveal a complex society requiring detailed regulation of everything from murder and theft to divorce and agricultural disputes. The principle of monetary compensation rather than physical retaliation for many offenses suggests an economically sophisticated society where social harmony mattered more than vengeful justice. The Code's prologue, claiming divine commission to establish justice and protect the weak, established rhetorical patterns that influenced all subsequent Mesopotamian law codes. Administrative archives from the Ur III period preserve millions of cuneiform tablets recording economic transactions, legal proceedings, and governmental correspondence. The provincial administration divided the empire into roughly 40 provinces, each governed by an ensi responsible for tax collection, labor mobilization, and judicial administration. The Bela system rotated tax obligations among provinces, with each taking turns provisioning the capital and major temples. This sophisticated fiscal system required enormous bureaucratic apparatus, with thousands of scribes maintaining records that tracked individual sheep, measured fields to fractions of acres, and counted workdays with obsessive precision. The construction projects of the Ur III period rivaled or exceeded those of any previous era. The great ziggurat at Ur, built by Ur-Nammu and completed by his son Shulgi, rose 70 feet above the plain in 3 massive stages, its baked brick facade gleaming in the desert sun. Similar structures were erected at Uruk, Eridu, and other cities, requiring millions of bricks and thousands of workers. Canals were extended and improved, with the maintenance records showing regular dredging and repair schedules. The city walls rebuilt during this period incorporated advanced defensive features, including glacis, moats, and complex gate systems. Shulgi, who ruled for nearly 50 years, transformed himself from administrator to divine king, claiming godhood midway through his reign. His hymns, among the most elaborate in Sumerian literature, present him as warrior, athlete, musician, and scholar, master of all human accomplishments and beloved of the gods. He claimed to have standardized weights and measures throughout the empire, established a network of roads with regular way stations, and created the world's first organized postal system. His military campaigns extended Ur's influence into Elam and the Iranian highlands, though these conquests proved difficult to maintain. The economic system of Ur III represented state control on an unprecedented scale. Temple estates and royal workshops employed tens of thousands of workers producing textiles, metalwork, and other goods for both domestic use and export. Ration lists show standardized distributions based on age, gender, and occupation, with special allowances for festivals and religious occasions. The commercialization of the economy advanced despite state control, with private merchants operating alongside official trade missions. Silver functioned as money in all but name, with prices quoted in silver shekels even when actual payment might be in barley or other commodities. The role of women in Ur III society, though still subordinate, included significant economic participation. Textile production, the empire's major export industry, employed primarily female workers organized in large workshops. Some women achieved positions as supervisors and administrators within these establishments. Priestesses continued to manage religious estates, while royal women participated in diplomatic marriages and occasionally governed provinces. Legal documents show women owning property, operating businesses, and initiating legal proceedings, though always within patriarchal constraints. Educational institutions flourished under Ur III patronage, with scribal schools producing the bureaucrats essential for imperial administration. The curriculum expanded beyond practical training to include literature, mathematics, and what might be called scientific subjects. Sumerian grammar was codified as the spoken language declined, ensuring its preservation for religious and scholarly purposes. Mathematical texts from this period show sophisticated understanding of geometric principles, algebraic concepts, and astronomical calculations. Medical texts, though still mixing magical and empirical approaches, demonstrate systematic observation of symptoms and treatments. The religious life of Ur III combined conservative Sumerian traditions with innovations reflecting imperial ideology. Month-long festivals brought together participants from throughout the empire, reinforcing cultural unity through shared ritual experiences. The sacred marriage ceremony, wherein the king symbolically united with the goddess Inanna to ensure fertility and prosperity, became an elaborate state occasion. Temple hymns commissioned by the court standardized liturgical practices while promoting royal ideology. The development of personal names incorporating divine elements suggests growing personal devotion alongside official state religion. International relations during the Ur-III period involved both military confrontation and sophisticated diplomacy. Marriage alliances connected the royal house with foreign dynasties, while diplomatic correspondence reveals complex negotiations over trade rights, extradition of fugitives, and border demarcation. The empire maintained standing armies at strategic points, but also employed diplomacy and bribery to manage border populations. Tribute from subordinate territories flowed to Ur, financing the imperial apparatus and monumental construction projects. The seeds of decline appeared even at the height of Ur-III prosperity. The intensive irrigation agriculture that supported dense populations led to increasing soil salinization, reducing crop yields in core territories. The bureaucratic apparatus, while ensuring efficient administration, consumed enormous resources in maintaining its own existence. Military pressure from Elamites in the east and Amorites in the west required constant vigilance and occasional campaigns. The very rigidity that made Ur-III administration effective also reduced flexibility in responding to changing circumstances. The collapse of the third dynasty of Ur around 2004 BCE ushered in an era of political fragmentation and cultural transformation that would reshape Mesopotamian civilization. The Elamites, having captured the last king of Ur and carried him into captivity, withdrew to their homeland, leaving a power vacuum filled by competing city-states and ambitious newcomers. Among these emerging forces, the Amorites, semi-nomadic peoples from the Syrian desert, who had long pressed against Mesopotamia's western borders, would prove most significant in determining the region's future trajectory. These Amorite groups, whom the urban Mesopotamians initially viewed with the same disdain they had shown toward the Gutians, possessed military skills honed through generations of movement across harsh landscapes and conflict with settled populations. Their social organization, based on tribal affiliations and personal loyalty to charismatic leaders, differed markedly from the bureaucratic structures of Sumerian city-states. Yet rather than destroying urban civilization, the Amorites absorbed and adapted Mesopotamian culture, establishing dynasties that would rule most major cities for centuries. The city of Babylon, previously a minor settlement overshadowed by ancient centers, like Ur and Uruk, emerged from this chaos as a new power center. Located at a strategic point where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers approached each other most closely, Babylon controlled vital trade routes and agricultural territories. The first dynasty of Babylon, established by the Amorite chief Sumuabum around 1894 BCE, initially controlled only the city and its immediate surroundings. Through patient diplomacy, strategic marriages, and selective military campaigns, successive rulers gradually expanded Babylonian influence. The political landscape of this old Babylonian period resembled a complex chess game with multiple players maneuvering for advantage. Isin and Larsa competed for the heritage of Ur in the south, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of Sumerian kingship. In the north, the kingdom of Mari controlled the middle Euphrates, while Assyrian merchant colonies extended trade networks into Anatolia. Elam maintained its influence in the east, occasionally intervening in Mesopotamian affairs. Smaller city-states formed shifting alliances, seeking protection from stronger neighbors while preserving as much autonomy as possible. Into this volatile environment stepped Hammurabi, sixth king of Babylon's Amorite dynasty, who ascended the throne around 1792 BCE. For the first 3 decades of his reign, Hammurabi appeared content with modest territorial gains and careful alliance management. He improved Babylon's irrigation systems, strengthened its fortifications, and cultivated relationships with neighboring rulers. His correspondence with Zimri-Lim of Mari reveals a shrewd diplomat who understood that patience and preparation often achieved more than premature aggression. The archives discovered at Mari provide extraordinary insights into the international relations of this period. Thousands of tablets preserve diplomatic correspondence, intelligence reports, and administrative documents that illuminate the complex negotiations, betrayals, and calculations that shaped political decisions. Ambassadors traveled constantly between courts, gathering information and conducting both public negotiations and secret dealings. Royal marriages created webs of obligation and potential conflict, as princesses brought not just dowries, but also claims and connections that could alter regional balances. The turning point in Hammurabi's reign came when Elam, seeking to dominate Mesopotamia, organized a coalition against Babylon. Rather than confronting this alliance directly, Hammurabi exploited divisions among his enemies, offering separate peace terms and turning former opponents into temporary allies. When the coalition fragmented, he struck decisively, conquering Larsa and incorporating southern Mesopotamia into his realm. Mari fell next, its destruction so complete that the city never recovered. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi controlled an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the northern reaches of Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi, history's most famous ancient law compilation, was promulgated late in his reign when his authority extended throughout Mesopotamia. Carved on stone stelae erected in public places, the Code's 282 laws addressed everything from property rights and commercial transactions to family relationships and criminal justice. The monument's upper section depicts Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and divine judge, legitimizing the code as divinely sanctioned rather than merely royal decree. The laws themselves reveal a complex, stratified society where legal consequences depended on social status. The population was divided into three primary categories: the Awilum, or free citizens, the Mushkanum, or dependent workers, and slaves. Penalties for identical crimes varied dramatically based on the perpetrators' and victims' social standing. Striking a free man might result in proportional retaliation, while striking a slave required only monetary compensation to the owner. This codification of inequality reflected social realities while providing predictability in legal proceedings. Commercial law occupied a prominent place in the code, indicating the economic sophistication of old Babylonian society. Regulations governed partnerships, loans, rental agreements, and agency relationships. Interest rates were standardized at 20% for silver loans and 33% for barley loans. The code addressed issues of commercial fraud, breach of contract, and liability for losses during transportation or storage. Maritime law provisions suggest active river and perhaps sea trade, with detailed rules about ship rental, cargo damage, and collision liability. Family law sections of the code reveal patriarchal structures tempered by certain protections for women and children. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement between families, with bride prices and dowries carefully negotiated. Women could own property, operate businesses, and initiate divorce under specific circumstances, though their rights remained subordinate to male authority. Inheritance laws favored sons but provided for daughters' dowries and widows' maintenance. Adoption was common and carefully regulated, allowing childless couples to secure heirs and elderly support. The mathematical achievements of the Old Babylonian period represent one of humanity's great intellectual breakthroughs. Building on Sumerian foundations, Babylonian mathematicians developed sophisticated algebraic methods for solving quadratic and even cubic equations. The famous tablet Plimpton 322 contains what appears to be Pythagorean triples, calculated 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Mathematical problem texts posed complex scenarios involving inheritance division, canal excavation, and architectural calculations, training scribes to apply abstract principles to practical situations. Babylonian astronomers made systematic observations that laid foundations for scientific astronomy. They tracked planetary movements, predicted eclipses, and developed mathematical models of celestial phenomena. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, recording observations of Venus over 21 years, represent one of history's earliest astronomical datasets. These observations were not purely scientific but served religious and political purposes, as celestial events were interpreted as divine messages requiring ritual responses or policy changes. The compilation of the Epic of Gilgamesh into its standard version during this period created what many consider the world's first great literary masterpiece. While the stories originated in Sumerian traditions, old Babylonian scribes wove them into a unified narrative exploring fundamental human concerns. The epic's themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning resonated across cultures, influencing literature from ancient Greece to modern times. Multiple versions circulated, suggesting an active literary culture, where scribes functioned as creative editors rather than mere copyists. Educational practices in old Babylonian schools combined practical training with cultural transmission. Students began by copying simple signs and syllables, progressing to lexical lists that preserved Sumerian vocabulary alongside Akkadian translations. Advanced students studied literary texts, mathematical problems, and legal formulas. The dialogue between master and student, preserved in several texts, reveals teaching methods that combined rote memorization with problem-solving exercises. Some texts suggest criticism of educational practices, with complaints about harsh discipline and outdated curricula that sound remarkably modern. Religious thought during this period showed both continuity with earlier traditions and significant innovations. The elevation of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, to supremacy among the gods reflected political realities while requiring theological justification. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, portrayed Marduk as the hero who defeated primordial chaos and organized the cosmos, earning the right to rule both gods and humans. This mythological revolution did not eliminate other deities, but subordinated them within a hierarchical pantheon mirroring earthly political structures. Personal religion flourished alongside state cults, with individuals maintaining devotional relationships with particular deities who served as divine patrons and protectors. Personal names incorporating divine elements became increasingly elaborate, expressing parental hopes and religious commitments. Votive offerings, ranging from cheap clay plaques to elaborate stone monuments, demonstrate widespread participation in religious life across social classes. Prayer texts reveal intimate concerns about health, prosperity, and divine favor, showing that ancient Mesopotamians grappled with existential anxieties familiar to all human societies. The role of divination expanded dramatically during the Old Babylonian period, with professional diviners serving both royal courts and private clients. Extispacy, the examination of sacrificed animals' entrails, developed elaborate protocols for interpreting the significance of various organs' appearances. Dream interpretation manuals catalogued thousands of dream scenarios with their supposed meanings. Astronomical omens linked celestial events to earthly consequences, creating complex systems for predicting everything from military victories to crop yields. These practices reflected not fatalism, but attempts to understand divine will and potentially influence outcomes through appropriate rituals. Medicine in old Babylonian times combined empirical observation with magical thinking in ways that seem contradictory to modern sensibilities but represented serious attempts to understand and treat illness. Medical texts describe symptoms in careful detail and prescribe treatments ranging from herbal remedies to surgical procedures. The understanding of contagion appears in recommendations for isolating certain patients. Yet these same texts attribute illness to demonic possession or divine punishment, prescribing amulets and incantations alongside practical treatments. The physician and the exorcist often work together, addressing both physical and spiritual dimensions of disease. Women's roles in old Babylonian society, though legally subordinate, included significant economic and religious functions. The Naditu women of Sippar, dedicated to the sun god Shamash, lived in cloistered communities where they engaged in business activities, property management, and money lending. These women, prohibited from bearing children, accumulated wealth that they could bequeath to chosen heirs, creating an unusual category of economically independent females. Tavern keepers, often women, operated businesses that served as social centers and informal banks, extending credit and facilitating commercial transactions. The material culture of the Old Babylonian period reflects both prosperity and artistic refinement. Terracotta plaques, mass-produced in molds, depicted religious scenes, mythological narratives, and erotic encounters, providing affordable art for ordinary homes. Cylinder seals achieved new levels of miniature detail, with presentation scenes showing worshippers before deities or kings. Jewelry incorporated new techniques, including granulation and filigree, while furniture inlays used precious materials to create elaborate decorative programs. The terracotta figurines of musicians, dancers, and wrestlers suggest public entertainments that enriched urban life. Trade networks during Hammurabi's reign and its aftermath extended throughout the known world. Babylonian merchants traveled to Dilmun in the Persian Gulf, serving as intermediaries for goods from the Indus Valley and Arabian Peninsula. The tin required for bronze production came from distant sources, possibly including Afghanistan and Central Asia. Textiles, Babylon's major export, reached markets from Egypt to Iran. The standardization of weights and measures under Hammurabi facilitated this commerce, while law codes protected merchants from arbitrary seizure and excessive taxation. Agricultural intensification supported growing urban populations, but created environmental challenges that would plague Mesopotamia for millennia. Extensive canal systems required constant maintenance to prevent silting and salinization. Labor obligations for canal work competed with agricultural demands, creating seasonal conflicts. Documents record disputes over water rights, with upstream communities accused of diverting excessive water or releasing floods that damaged downstream fields. The gradual southward shift of agricultural productivity suggested increasing salinization in older cultivated areas, a problem that contributed to long-term economic decline. The decline of Hammurabi's empire began almost immediately after his death around 1750 BCE. His son, Samsu-Iluna, faced rebellions throughout the realm, losing control of the southern cities despite military campaigns that consumed much of his reign. The reasons for this rapid fragmentation remain debated, but economic exhaustion from continuous warfare, environmental degradation, and the inherent difficulties of maintaining centralized control over diverse populations all contributed. The South entered a period known as the Sealand dynasty, about which little is known except that it maintained independence for over 2 centuries. External pressures intensified as new peoples entered Mesopotamia. The Kassites, originating from the Zagros Mountains, began infiltrating Babylonia as mercenaries and agricultural workers. Unlike previous invaders who adopted Mesopotamian culture wholesale, the Kassites maintained distinct traditions while selectively incorporating Babylonian practices. Their military skills, particularly in horse breeding and chariot warfare, gave them advantages over traditional Mesopotamian armies. By 1595 BCE, when the Hittite king Masilis I raided Babylon and ended the First Dynasty, Kassite groups were positioned to fill the resulting power vacuum. The Hittite raid itself remains mysterious, as the Hittites withdrew immediately after sacking Babylon, making no attempt to establish permanent control. This event may have been motivated by plunder, elimination of a potential rival, or internal Hittite politics requiring a military victory. Whatever the motivation, the raid's consequences reshaped Mesopotamian politics, ending the Amorite dynasty and enabling Kassite ascendancy. The Kassites would rule Babylon for over 4 centuries, the longest dynasty in Mesopotamian history, though much of their early period remains obscure due to limited sources. The transition to Kassite rule marked a significant cultural shift. Where previous conquerors had quickly adopted Babylonian traditions, The Kassites maintained distinctive practices including different burial customs, architectural styles, and religious preferences. They introduced the horse as a significant element in Mesopotamian warfare and society, with horse breeding becoming a specialized and prestigious occupation. The kuduru, or boundary stone, became a characteristic Kassite artifact, recording land grants with elaborate divine symbols and curses against violators. Despite their foreign origins, the Kassites became devoted custodians of Babylonian culture. They commissioned copies of ancient texts, preserving literary and religious traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The Kassite period saw the standardization of many cuneiform texts, creating canonical versions that would be transmitted to later periods. They maintained traditional temple cults while introducing their own deities into the pantheon. This cultural synthesis created a distinctive Middle Babylonian civilization that influenced surrounding regions. International relations during the Kassite period entered a new phase of diplomatic sophistication. The Amarna letters discovered in Egypt preserve correspondence between Kassite Babylon and the Egyptian pharaohs, revealing a club of great powers that maintained regular diplomatic contact. These kings addressed each other as brothers, exchanging gifts, negotiating marriages, and managing conflicts through diplomacy rather than warfare when possible. Gold from Egypt, horses from Babylon, and luxury goods from all regions circulated among royal courts, creating an international elite culture. The economic structures of Kassite Babylonia showed both continuity and innovation. Large estates controlled by temples, the crown, and noble families dominated agricultural production. These estates operated on feudal-like principles, with land granted in exchange for military or administrative service. Yet commercial activity continued, with private merchants maintaining trade networks despite political fragmentation. The use of gold alongside silver as a monetary standard reflected increased international trade and possibly inflation in silver values. Social organization under the Kassites developed distinctive features that would influence later periods. The population was organized into professional and ethnic groups with hereditary obligations and privileges. This system provided social stability but reduced mobility, as sons generally followed their fathers' occupations. Rural communities gained greater autonomy, with village assemblies managing local affairs under loose oversight from provincial governors. This decentralization may have weakened royal power, but created resilience against external shocks. The religious life of Kassite Babylonia maintained traditional Mesopotamian practices while showing increasing personal devotion. Cylinder seals frequently depicted their owners in prayer before divine symbols, suggesting individual relationships with deities. The production of inexpensive votive objects allowed ordinary people to make offerings at temples. Personal names became increasingly theophoric, incorporating divine elements that expressed religious commitments or sought divine protection. This personalization of religion would continue developing in subsequent periods. While Babylon experienced the transitions from Amorite to Kassite rule, a different trajectory unfolded in northern Mesopotamia, where the city of Ashur developed into the center of what would become history's first truly militaristic empire. The Assyrians, named after their patron deity Ashur, emerged from the same Semitic-speaking populations that had produced the Akkadian Empire, but their development followed distinct patterns shaped by geography, economics, and cultural choices that emphasized military prowess above all other achievements. The city of Ashur occupied a strategic position on the western bank of the Tigris River, perched on a rocky promontory that provided natural defenses while controlling river crossings and caravan routes. Unlike the southern Mesopotamian cities surrounded by irrigated fields, Ashur depended more heavily on trade than agriculture, as rainfall agriculture in the north proved less reliable than irrigation systems. This commercial orientation shaped Assyrian society from its earliest periods, creating a mercantile elite that understood profit margins, risk management, and the vital importance of securing trade routes through whatever means necessary. The Old Assyrian period, roughly 2000 to 1750 BCE, witnessed one of history's earliest experiments in long-distance commercial colonization. Assyrian merchants established a network of trading colonies called Karum throughout Anatolia, with the settlement at Kultepe serving as the primary hub. These merchants operated with remarkable independence, maintaining their own legal systems, commercial practices, and cultural identity, while living hundreds of miles from their homeland. The tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets discovered at Kultepe preserve intimate details of their operations, from complex partnership agreements to personal letters complaining about delayed shipments and unfaithful wives. The primary commodity that drove this trade was tin, essential for bronze production, but unavailable in Mesopotamia or Anatolia. Assyrian merchants imported tin from sources in Central Asia or Iran, combined it with Anatolian copper, and distributed the resulting bronze throughout the ancient Near East. Textiles formed the other major trade good, with fine fabrics from southern Mesopotamia commanding premium prices in Anatolian markets. The profits from this trade enriched Ashur and financed the construction of temples, fortifications, and public buildings that proclaimed the city's growing prosperity and ambition. The organization of Old Assyrian trade reveals sophisticated financial instruments that would not seem out of place in medieval or even modern commerce. Merchants formed joint stock companies where investors contributed capital and shared profits according to predetermined formulas. Letters of credit allowed traders to move wealth without physically transporting silver or gold. Commercial loans with compound interest financed trading expeditions, while insurance arrangements protected against losses from bandits or accidents. The legal framework governing these transactions, preserved in thousands of contracts and court decisions, demonstrates a complex understanding of commercial law and international business practices. Political structures in Old Assyrian times differed markedly from the autocratic kingship that would later characterize the empire. The limu system, whereby years were named after annual officials selected from the aristocracy, suggests a more oligarchic government where merchant families shared power. The king functioned more as first among equals than absolute ruler, with important decisions requiring consultation with the city assembly and elder council. This collective governance reflected the mercantile character of Assyrian society, where successful trade required cooperation and consensus rather than autocratic command. The collapse of the Old Assyrian trading network around 1750 BCE resulted from multiple factors, including political upheavals in Anatolia, the rise of Hammurabi's Babylon, and possibly climate changes affecting trade routes. For several centuries afterward, Assyria fell under foreign domination, first by Babylon and then by the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. Yet this period of subordination proved temporary, as Assyrian leaders waited for opportunities to reassert independence and begin the transformation from trading city to military powerhouse. The Middle Assyrian period commenced with Ashur-uballit around 1365 BCE, who exploited the weakening of Mitanni to establish Assyrian independence and begin territorial expansion. His successors continued this aggressive policy, pushing westward to the Euphrates and eastward into the Zagros Mountains. The transformation of Assyria from commercial hub to territorial empire required fundamental changes in social organization, administrative structures, and above all, military doctrine that would make Assyrian armies the most feared forces in the ancient world. Military innovation became the defining characteristic of Middle Assyrian society. Iron weapons, though not yet common, began supplementing bronze armaments, providing harder and more durable cutting edges. The Assyrians pioneered the use of cavalry as a distinct military arm, training riders to fire bows accurately from horseback while controlling their mounts with their knees. Siege warfare techniques advanced dramatically, with specialized engineer corps developing battering rams, siege towers, and undermining techniques that could reduce even the strongest fortifications. The psychological dimension of warfare received equal attention, with deliberate policies of terror designed to encourage surrender without costly sieges. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, around 1115 to 1076 BCE, marked the first peak of Assyrian military expansion. His armies reached the Mediterranean Sea, extracting tribute from Phoenician cities and receiving gifts from Egypt. His inscriptions boast of hunting expeditions where he killed lions, wild bulls, and elephants, demonstrating the martial prowess expected of Assyrian kings. Yet his conquests proved ephemeral, as Aramean invasions and internal instabilities reduced Assyria to its core territories within a generation of his death. This pattern of expansion and contraction would repeat several times before the establishment of lasting imperial control. The Aramean invasions that weakened Assyria around 1100 BCE formed part of larger population movements affecting the entire Near East. These tribal groups, originating from the Syrian desert, established small kingdoms throughout Syria and Mesopotamia, disrupting trade routes and threatening urban centers. The Assyrian response to this crisis involved both military campaigns to secure immediate territories and diplomatic efforts to incorporate Aramean groups into the empire. Over time, Aramaic language and script would profoundly influence Assyrian administration, eventually becoming the lingua franca of the Near East. Administrative innovations during the Middle Assyrian period laid foundations for later imperial governance. Provincial governments replaced traditional local rulers with appointed Assyrian officials responsible directly to the king. Regular censuses tracked population and resources available for taxation and military conscription. Legal codes, building on Mesopotamian traditions but incorporating distinctly Assyrian elements, standardized judicial procedures throughout controlled territories. The development of a royal road system with regular way stations and mounted messengers enabled rapid communication between the capital and distant provinces. The rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 911 BCE represented not merely territorial expansion, but a fundamental transformation in how ancient states projected power and controlled populations. Ashurnasirpal II and his successors created military machines of unprecedented efficiency, combining professional soldiers, conscript levies, and specialized units into coordinated forces capable of sustained campaigns across diverse terrains. The annual campaign season became institutionalized, with armies mobilizing each spring to extend borders, collect tribute, or suppress rebellions. The Assyrian military system incorporated innovations that would influence warfare for millennia. Infantry units were organized into decimal formations of 10, 50, 100, and 1,000, facilitating command and control. Specialized troops included heavily armored spearmen, mobile archers, cavalry squadrons, and engineer corps. Logistics received careful attention, with supply depots established along campaign routes and detailed records kept of equipment distribution. Intelligence networks provided information about enemy movements and political conditions, enabling strategic planning rather than mere tactical response. Siege warfare under the Neo-Assyrians reached levels of sophistication not equaled until the Roman period. Assyrian engineers constructed massive siege engines, protected by metal plates and raw hides against defensive fire. Battering rams with iron heads could breach walls, while archers on the engine's towers suppressed defenders. When direct assault proved impractical, engineers undermined walls or constructed earthen ramps, allowing troops to march directly onto fortifications. The combination of engineering skill and ruthless determination made Assyrian sieges nearly irresistible, encouraging cities to surrender rather than resist. The policy of forced deportation, employed systematically by Neo-Assyrian rulers, served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple cruelty. Moving conquered populations to distant regions broke traditional loyalties and prevented organized resistance. Skilled craftsmen and agricultural specialists were relocated where their expertise could benefit the empire. Different ethnic groups were deliberately mixed to prevent coalition building based on shared identity. While brutal, these deportations created cosmopolitan populations that facilitated cultural exchange and technological diffusion throughout the empire. Tiglath-Pileser III, ruling from 745 to 727 BCE, reformed the Assyrian state to create more efficient imperial administration. He reduced the power of provincial governors by subdividing provinces and appointing eunuchs who could not establish hereditary dynasties. The transformation of conquered territories from tribute-paying vassals to directly administered provinces increased royal revenues and control. His military reforms created the first truly professional army in history, with soldiers serving year-round rather than returning to agricultural work between campaigns. These changes established patterns of imperial governance that would influence subsequent empires from Persia to Rome. The reign of Sargon the Great, from 722 to 705 BCE, demonstrated both the power and vulnerabilities of the Assyrian system. His conquest of Samaria ended the northern kingdom of Israel, with much of the population deported to Mesopotamia and Media. The construction of Dur-Sharrukin, a new capital built from scratch, showcased imperial wealth and architectural ambition. Yet Sargon died in battle against Anatolian enemies. His body never recovered, which Assyrians interpreted as divine displeasure, requiring ritual responses and policy reassessments. Sennacherib, son of Sargon II, moved the capital to Nineveh and transformed it into the ancient world's largest city. His palace, covering several acres, featured elaborate relief sculptures depicting military victories and engineering achievements. The famous Siege of Lachish in Judah, commemorated in detailed palace reliefs now in the British Museum, shows Assyrian siege techniques in operation. Sennacherib's assassination by his own sons revealed persistent succession conflicts that weakened Assyrian stability despite military dominance. The hydraulic engineering projects of Sennacherib surpassed anything previously attempted in Mesopotamia. Aqueducts carried water over 50 miles to Nineveh, crossing valleys on stone bridges that required precise gradient calculations. The Jerwan Aqueduct, with its pointed arches and waterproof cement, anticipated Roman engineering by centuries. Gardens irrigated by mechanical water-lifting devices created artificial paradises within palace complexes. These projects demonstrated not just technical capability, but the ability to mobilize resources and expertise from throughout the empire. Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, the last great Neo-Assyrian kings, extended the empire to its greatest extent while also revealing its inherent limitations. Esarhaddon conquered Egypt, achieving what no Mesopotamian ruler had accomplished, but maintaining control over such distant territories proved impossible. Ashurbanipal's suppression of rebellions in Babylon and Elam involved destruction so thorough that these ancient civilizations never fully recovered. The costs of continuous warfare, both economic and social, gradually exhausted Assyrian resources and will. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh represents one of history's most significant cultural achievements. This collection, containing over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, preserved the literary heritage of Mesopotamian civilization. Ashurbanipal's scribes collected texts from throughout the empire, creating standardized editions of classic works. The library included epic literature, religious texts, scientific treatises, historical chronicles, and magical handbooks. The organizational system, with tablets arranged by subject and catalogued for easy retrieval, established principles of library science still followed today. The preservation of the Epic of Gilgamesh in Ashurbanipal's library ensured this masterpiece's survival to modern times. Multiple versions were collected and compared, creating a standard version that incorporated variants from different traditions. Commentaries and translations facilitated understanding of archaic language and obscure references. The scholarly apparatus surrounding these texts reveals sophisticated philological methods and historical consciousness. Without Ashurbanipal's collecting passion, much of ancient Mesopotamian literature would have vanished forever. Educational practices in Neo-Assyrian times reflected imperial needs for administrators, diplomats, and military officers. Scribal schools trained students not just in cuneiform writing, but in multiple languages including Akkadian, Sumerian, and increasingly Aramaic. Mathematical education emphasized practical applications in engineering, logistics, and taxation. Historical texts served as training materials for future officials, teaching political lessons through past examples. The curriculum's breadth produced educated elites capable of managing diverse populations and complex administrative challenges. Religious practices under the Neo-Assyrians combined traditional Mesopotamian polytheism with innovations reflecting imperial ideology. The god Ashur evolved from city patron to universal sovereign, with other deities subordinated as his servants. Royal inscriptions portrayed military campaigns as divine missions to extend Ashur's dominion. Temples throughout the empire received royal patronage, but local cults were expected to acknowledge Assyrian supremacy. This religious imperialism created tensions with conquered populations whose own gods were diminished or absorbed into the Assyrian pantheon. Art under the Neo-Assyrians achieved a distinctive style characterized by narrative relief sculptures of unprecedented scale and detail. Palace walls were covered with scenes of military campaigns, royal hunts, and court ceremonies carved in limestone or gypsum. These reliefs served both decorative and propagandistic purposes, impressing visitors with Assyrian power while providing visual narratives of imperial achievements. The attention to anatomical detail in both human and animal figures, the complex compositions depicting multiple simultaneous actions, and the psychological intensity of scenes showing dying lions or fleeing enemies created artistic masterpieces that influenced subsequent art for millennia. The depiction of warfare in Assyrian reliefs provides invaluable historical documentation while revealing cultural attitudes toward violence and power. Scenes of impalement, flaying, and decapitation were not hidden but prominently displayed, suggesting that terror was considered a legitimate and even admirable tool of statecraft. Yet these same reliefs show careful attention to architectural details, costume variations among different peoples, and landscape features that demonstrate genuine interest in documenting the diversity of the known world. Technological achievements of the Neo-Assyrian period extended beyond military applications. Ironworking became increasingly sophisticated, with techniques for carburization producing steel of varying hardness. Glass-making advanced from simple beads to elaborate vessels and architectural elements. The use of glazed bricks for architectural decoration, particularly the stunning blue glazes that would later characterize Babylon's Ishtar Gate, originated in Assyrian workshops. These technical innovations spread throughout the empire and beyond through the movement of craftsmen and the demands of imperial projects. Economic structures in the Neo-Assyrian Empire combined state control with private enterprise in complex ways. The palace and temples owned vast estates worked by dependent laborers and slaves, particularly deportees from conquered territories. Yet private merchants operated extensive trade networks, often in partnership with state institutions. The use of silver as currency became nearly universal, with standardized weights ensuring commercial predictability. Credit instruments, including promissory notes and letters of credit, facilitated long-distance trade despite political instabilities. The role of women in Neo-Assyrian society showed both continuities with earlier periods and distinctive features. Royal women occasionally wielded significant power, particularly queen mothers who influenced succession decisions. The harem institution, housing wives, concubines, and their children, became an important political space where alliances were forged and conspiracies hatched. Professional women worked as merchants, tavern keepers, and textile producers, though legal restrictions limited their autonomy. Religious roles for women included positions as priestesses and temple functionaries, though the highest religious offices remained male preserves. provincial administration under the Neo-Assyrians achieved remarkable standardization across culturally diverse territories. Governors reported directly to the king through regular dispatches that were archived in the capital. Standardized tax assessments, military levies, and labor obligations were imposed regardless of local traditions. The Assyrian calendar was enforced throughout the empire, facilitating administrative coordination. Yet this standardization also created rigidities that prevented effective responses to local conditions, contributing to periodic rebellions. Intelligence gathering and communication systems enabled Assyrian kings to maintain awareness of conditions throughout their vast empire. A network of spies and informants reported on political developments, economic conditions, and potential threats. The royal road system, with mounted messengers changing horses at regular intervals, could carry messages from the capital to distant provinces in days rather than weeks. Fire signals and courier pigeons provided even faster communication for urgent military intelligence. This information network gave Assyrian rulers advantages in responding to challenges before they became critical threats. The decline of the Neo-Assyrian Empire occurred with stunning rapidity after Ashurbanipal's death around 631 BCE. Civil war between rival claimants to the throne weakened central authority, while provincial governors asserted increasing independence. The Babylonians under Nabopolassar allied with the Medes from Iran to challenge Assyrian dominance. Economic exhaustion from continuous warfare reduced resources available for military operations. The psychological impact of military defeats shattered the aura of invincibility that had sustained Assyrian power. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE marked not just the end of a political system but the destruction of a civilization that had dominated the Near East for centuries. The combined Babylonian and Median armies so thoroughly destroyed the city that its location was forgotten until rediscovery by archaeologists in the 19th century. The biblical prophet Nahum's celebration of Nineveh's fall reflects the hatred Assyrian policies had generated among subject peoples. Yet the administrative techniques, military innovations, and cultural achievements of the Assyrians profoundly influenced subsequent empires, creating templates for imperial rule that would endure throughout antiquity. The destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE created a power vacuum that Babylon, after centuries of subjugation, was uniquely positioned to fill. Nabopolassar, who had led the rebellion against Assyrian rule, established the Neo-Babylonian Empire on foundations that consciously evoked the glory of Hammurabi's age, while incorporating lessons learned from Assyrian administrative and military practices. This final independent Mesopotamian empire would burn brilliantly but briefly, creating architectural wonders that amazed the ancient world, advancing astronomical knowledge to unprecedented levels, and generating religious and philosophical insights that would influence human thought for millennia. Nabopolassar faced the immediate challenge of preventing the Assyrian Empire's territories from fragmenting into independent kingdoms. Moving swiftly after Nineveh's fall, Babylonian armies secured Mesopotamia proper and pushed westward toward the Mediterranean coast. At Carchemish in 605 BCE, Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptian army that had hoped to claim former Assyrian territories in Syria-Palestine. This victory established Babylonian hegemony over the western provinces and announced the arrival of a new imperial power that would surpass even Assyrian achievements in certain spheres. Nebuchadnezzar II, ascending the throne upon his father's death, would reign for 43 years and transform Babylon into the ancient world's most magnificent city. His building projects exceeded anything previously attempted, not merely in scale but in artistic ambition and technical innovation. Where Assyrian kings had emphasized military might in their monuments, Nebuchadnezzar celebrated architectural beauty, religious devotion, and cosmic order. His inscriptions, while mentioning military victories, devoted far more attention to temple construction, canal excavation, and urban beautification. The city of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar covered nearly 1,000 hectares, enclosed by a double wall system that Greek historians considered one of the world's wonders. The outer wall, named Imgur-Enlil, stretched over 11 miles in circumference, wide enough for chariots to pass on its summit. The inner wall, Nemeti-Enlil, provided a second line of defense while creating a fortified zone where the population could shelter during sieges. These walls incorporated hundreds of defensive towers and were surrounded by a moat connected to the Euphrates River, making Babylon virtually impregnable to contemporary siege techniques. The Ishtar Gate, Babylon's northern entrance, exemplified the artistic achievements of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. This massive portal, standing over 40 feet high, was covered entirely in glazed bricks of brilliant blue, decorated with alternating rows of dragons and bulls molded in relief. The dragons represented Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, while the bulls symbolized Adad, god of storms. The technical mastery required to produce consistent glazes, fire thousands of decorated bricks, and assemble them into perfectly aligned patterns demonstrated both artistic vision and organizational capability. The processional way leading to the gate was lined with glazed brick walls depicting lions, creating an avenue of supernatural power that awed visitors and citizens alike. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, if they existed as described by Greek historians, represented an even more ambitious undertaking. According to tradition, Nebuchadnezzar built these terraced gardens for his Median wife, who missed the mountains of her homeland. The gardens supposedly rose in a series of vaulted terraces to a height of 75 feet, irrigated by an ingenious system of pumps that lifted water from the Euphrates. Trees and flowering plants from throughout the empire created an artificial paradise that seemed to float above the city. While archaeological evidence for the gardens remains elusive, leading some scholars to suggest they were actually located in Nineveh, the detailed ancient descriptions suggest some extraordinary garden complex existed that pushed the boundaries of hydraulic engineering. The Etemenanki ziggurat, which probably inspired the biblical Tower of Babel story, rose nearly 300 feet above the city in 7 stages, each painted a different color representing celestial bodies. At its summit stood a temple where, according to Herodotus, the god Marduk was believed to spend nights with a specially chosen priestess. The structure required millions of bricks and decades of construction, involving tens of thousands of workers. Its completion fulfilled Mesopotamian royal ideology dating back millennia, creating an axis mundi where heaven and earth intersected. Nebuchadnezzar's palace complex rivaled his religious constructions in magnificence. The southern palace, his primary residence, contained 5 courtyards surrounded by elaborate reception halls, residential quarters, and administrative offices. The famous throne room, where the prophet Daniel was said to have interpreted divine writing on the wall, measured over 50 by 17 meters, its walls decorated with glazed brick panels depicting stylized trees and floral motifs. The palace's hanging gardens, if located here rather than as a separate structure, would have crowned the northeastern corner, creating a verdant mountain visible throughout the city. The economic prosperity that supported these construction projects derived from multiple sources. Babylon controlled the richest agricultural lands in Mesopotamia, with canal systems refined over millennia, maximizing productivity. Trade routes from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean passed through Babylonian territory, generating customs revenues and commercial profits. Tribute from subject territories, while less systematically extracted than under the Assyrians, provided additional resources. The concentration of skilled craftsmen attracted by royal projects created manufacturing centers producing goods for export throughout the ancient world. The Jewish exile in Babylon, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar's deportation of Judah's elite after Jerusalem's first capture in 597 BCE and continuing after the city's destruction in 586 BCE, profoundly influenced both Jewish and world religious development. Unlike Assyrian deportations designed to destroy cultural identity, the Babylonian exile allowed Jewish communities to maintain their traditions while exposing them to Mesopotamian learning. The encounter between Jewish monotheism and Babylonian cosmology generated theological innovations that would shape Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The exilic experience forced Jewish thinkers to grapple with fundamental questions about divine justice, chosen peoplehood, and the meaning of suffering. The prophecies of Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah, composed in Babylonian exile, developed concepts of individual responsibility, universal divine sovereignty, and redemptive suffering that transcended traditional national religion. The systematic codification of Jewish law and the editing of biblical texts during this period created written foundations for religious practice that could survive without temple, priesthood, or territorial sovereignty. Babylonian influence on Jewish thought extended beyond theology to cosmology, angelology, and apocalypticism. The elaborate hierarchies of divine beings in later Jewish texts show Babylonian influence, as do concepts of cosmic conflict between good and evil forces. The biblical creation account in Genesis, while maintaining distinctive theological perspectives, incorporates Mesopotamian motifs of primordial waters, divine speech creating reality, and humans formed from clay. The Babylonian New Year festival, with its themes of cosmic renewal and divine enthronement, influenced Jewish concepts of divine kingship and eschatological hope. Astronomical observations during the Neo-Babylonian period achieved scientific precision that would not be surpassed until the telescope's invention. Babylonian astronomers systematically recorded celestial phenomena for centuries, creating datasets that revealed subtle patterns in planetary motions, eclipse cycles, and stellar positions. The discovery that planetary movements could be predicted mathematically rather than merely observed empirically represented a conceptual revolution that would influence all subsequent astronomy. The astronomical diaries maintained by Babylonian priests recorded daily observations of celestial bodies along with terrestrial events including weather, commodity prices, and political developments. These texts, covering over 6 centuries, provide the longest continuous scientific dataset from the ancient world. The correlation of celestial and terrestrial phenomena reflected Babylonian beliefs about cosmic influence on earthly affairs, but also generated statistical data that revealed actual patterns, such as the relationship between lunar phases and tides. Mathematical astronomy flourished as Babylonian scholars developed sophisticated techniques for calculating celestial positions and predicting astronomical events. The ephemerides tables they produced could predict planetary positions years in advance with remarkable accuracy. The discovery of the Saros cycle, whereby similar eclipses repeat every 18 years and 11 days, enabled eclipse prediction centuries into the future. These achievements required not just observation, but mathematical modeling of complex periodic phenomena, establishing principles that would guide astronomy until the heliocentric revolution. The division of the sky into 12 zodiacal signs, while building on earlier traditions, achieved its classical form during the Neo-Babylonian period. Each constellation was associated with specific months, deities, and supposed influences on human affairs. This system, transmitted through Greek and Islamic astronomy to medieval Europe, continues to influence popular culture through astrology. More significantly, the zodiac provided a coordinate system for tracking celestial movements that remained useful for scientific astronomy well into the modern period. Religious developments during the Neo-Babylonian period showed both conservative tendencies and innovative syntheses. The Akitu New Year festival became increasingly elaborate, with 12 days of rituals including the king's ritual humiliation and renewal, the recitation of the creation epic, and massive public processions. These ceremonies reinforced social hierarchy while providing communal participation in cosmic renewal. The festival's themes of order, emerging from chaos, divine kingship validated through trial, and collective purification influenced religious traditions throughout the ancient world. The elevation of Marduk to supreme deity, begun during Hammurabi's reign, reached its theological culmination in texts that portrayed him absorbing the powers and identities of other gods. The Enuma Elish creation epic was recited annually, reinforcing Marduk's position as cosmic sovereign who organized the universe and established divine justice. This tendency toward theological centralization, while not achieving true monotheism, created conceptual frameworks that influenced later monotheistic traditions. The identification of various gods as aspects or manifestations of Marduk suggested divine unity underlying polytheistic multiplicity. Personal piety flourished alongside state religion, with individuals maintaining devotional relationships with particular deities who served as personal protectors. Prayer texts from this period show intimate communications with divine beings, expressing fears, hopes, and gratitude in touching human terms. The production of inexpensive votive offerings and amulets indicates widespread popular participation in religious life. Name changes incorporating divine elements, particularly Marduk and Nabu, demonstrate personal religious commitments that transcended mere conformity to official ideology. Wisdom literature reached new heights of sophistication during the Neo-Babylonian period, grappling with perennial questions about justice, suffering, and the meaning of existence. The Babylonian theodicy, structured as a dialogue between a sufferer and his friend, explored the problem of evil with philosophical rigor that anticipated later discussions in Job and Greek philosophy. The dialogue of pessimism, a satirical conversation between master and servant, questioned whether any human action had ultimate meaning, revealing an existential sophistication that challenges stereotypes about ancient thought. The development of apocalyptic literature, while reaching full expression in Jewish and later Christian texts, showed Babylonian influence in its imagery and conceptual structures. Visions of cosmic conflict, divine judgment, and world transformation drew on Mesopotamian mythological traditions while expressing new historical consciousness about empire, exile, and redemption. The figure of the divine warrior defeating chaos monsters, central to apocalyptic imagery, derived from Babylonian combat myths while acquiring new meaning in contexts of political oppression and eschatological hope. Legal traditions during the Neo-Babylonian period built on ancient Mesopotamian precedents while showing increased commercial sophistication. Business documents from the Murashu and Ejibi family archives reveal complex financial operations, including international trade, real estate development, and banking services. The use of written contracts for virtually all transactions, from marriage agreements to apprenticeship arrangements, indicates a highly legalistic society where documentation provided security in an increasingly complex economy. The role of temple institutions in the Neo-Babylonian economy combined religious, economic, and social functions in ways that would influence later temple states. Temples owned vast agricultural estates, operated manufacturing workshops, and provided credit services. They maintained schools, supported scholars, and preserved literary traditions. The redistribution of offerings through temple personnel created social welfare systems that provided for widows, orphans, and others lacking family support. This institutional structure influenced later Christian monasticism and Islamic Waqf foundations. Educational practices emphasized practical training for administrative and commercial careers while maintaining classical literary traditions. Scribal schools taught not only cuneiform writing but also Aramaic, which was becoming the international language of diplomacy and commerce. Mathematical education focused on problems relevant to trade, construction, and astronomy. The preservation and copying of ancient texts ensured cultural continuity, while new compositions reflected contemporary concerns and sensibilities. The material culture of Neo-Babylonian times reflected both prosperity and cosmopolitan influences. Jewelry incorporated techniques and designs from throughout the empire, combining Mesopotamian traditions with Egyptian, Persian, and Greek influences. Furniture inlaid with ivory and precious metals demonstrated wealth while revealing artistic preferences for natural motifs and geometric patterns. Cylinder seals, while continuing ancient functions, showed new artistic styles influenced by Persian and Greek art, suggesting cultural exchange despite political boundaries. Architecture beyond royal monuments showed increased sophistication in private houses and commercial buildings. Courtyard houses in Babylon and other cities featured sophisticated drainage systems, plastered walls decorated with frescoes, and sometimes private bathrooms with ceramic toilets. Commercial districts contained specialized buildings for different trades, with workshops, warehouses, and retail spaces designed for specific functions. The urban planning evident in Neo-Babylonian cities, with regular street grids, designated market areas, and zoned activities, influenced later Hellenistic and Roman city design. The position of women in Neo-Babylonian society showed both continuities with earlier periods and distinctive features. Women could own property, operate businesses, and initiate legal proceedings. The Nadi women continued their roles as celibate priestesses engaged in economic activities. Yet legal documents also reveal restrictions on women's autonomy, with male guardianship required for many transactions. The practice of marriage contracts specifying women's rights and protections suggests both vulnerability and agency within patriarchal structures. International relations during the Neo-Babylonian period involved complex negotiations with emerging powers, including Median Kingdom and distant Egypt. Diplomatic correspondence, though less well preserved than earlier archives, reveals sophisticated protocol and careful attention to precedence and reciprocity. Royal marriages cemented alliances while creating potential succession disputes. The exchange of specialists, from physicians to astrologers, facilitated technology transfer and cultural exchange that enriched all participating civilizations. The economic foundations of Neo-Babylonian prosperity proved fragile despite apparent strength. Intensive agriculture continued depleting soil fertility despite sophisticated management techniques. The costs of monumental construction projects and military campaigns strained resources. Competition from Greek traders began affecting traditional Babylonian commercial networks. Environmental changes, including possible climate fluctuations and certainly increasing salinization, reduced agricultural productivity in core territories. The reign of Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, revealed both the empire's cultural vitality and political vulnerabilities. His archaeological excavations at ancient sites and restoration of long-abandoned temples demonstrated historical consciousness and religious devotion. Yet his promotion of the moon god Sin over Marduk alienated the Babylonian priesthood, while his long absence in Arabia pursuing unclear objectives weakened royal authority. When Cyrus of Persia invaded in 539 BCE, Babylon fell without battle, its citizens reportedly welcoming the conqueror who promised to respect their traditions. The grand narratives of kings and conquests tell only part of Mesopotamia's story, for beneath the chronicles of empire lay the rhythms of daily existence that remained remarkably consistent across millennia. From sunrise prayers to evening meals, from birth celebrations to funeral laments, the people of ancient Mesopotamia lived lives of surprising complexity and familiarity. Their joys and sorrows, preserved in personal letters, legal documents, and archaeological remains, reveal human experiences that transcend the vast temporal distance separating their world from ours. The Mesopotamian family formed the fundamental unit of social organization, a patriarchal structure that nonetheless accommodated considerable variation and female agency. Households typically consisted of nuclear families, though elderly parents, unmarried siblings, and servants might expand the domestic unit. The eldest male exercised legal authority over family members and property. Yet practical household management often fell to wives who controlled domestic economies, supervised servants, and made daily decisions affecting family welfare. Children were valued as future support for aging parents, with sons carrying particular importance for continuing family lines and maintaining ancestor cults. Marriage in Mesopotamia functioned as both economic alliance and social institution, negotiated between families with careful attention to property rights and inheritance. Marriage contracts, preserved by thousands in cuneiform archives, specified bride prices paid by grooms' families and dowries provided by brides' fathers. These agreements detailed what would happen to property if the marriage ended through divorce or death, protecting women's economic interests within patriarchal constraints. The contracts might include clauses about taking second wives, with first wives often retaining superior status and their children enjoying primary inheritance rights. Wedding ceremonies combined legal formalities with festive celebrations that brought communities together. The bride processed from her father's house to her new home, accompanied by musicians, dancers, and gift-bearing relatives. Wedding feasts might last several days, with elaborate meals, entertainment, and ritual performances ensuring divine blessing on the union. The consummation of marriage had legal significance, with blood-stained sheets sometimes preserved as proof of the bride's virginity, though such emphasis on female purity was balanced by practical recognition that widows and divorced women could remarry with honor intact. Childbirth represented both joy and danger in a world where maternal and infant mortality remained high despite medical knowledge. Pregnant women wore amulets depicting the demon-fighting goddess Lamashtu to protect against miscarriage and birth complications. Midwives, respected professionals who passed their knowledge through generations, assisted deliveries using techniques including massage, herbal preparations, and incantations. The moment of birth required ritual purification, with the newborn washed, rubbed with salt, and wrapped in swaddling clothes, while prayers ensured divine protection against malevolent spirits. Childhood in Mesopotamia varied dramatically by social class, but generally involved gradual integration into adult responsibilities. Elite children might begin formal education around age 5, learning to read and write in scribal schools that demanded years of rigorous training. Working-class children helped with household tasks, agricultural work, or craft production from an early age, acquiring skills through observation and practice rather than formal instruction. Play was not absent from children's lives, as archaeological finds of toys including wheeled animals, spinning tops, and board games demonstrate recognition that children required recreation and imaginative development. Education for most Mesopotamians occurred within family contexts, with fathers teaching sons their professions and mothers instructing daughters in domestic skills. This informal apprenticeship system preserved craft traditions and agricultural knowledge across generations while maintaining social stratification. Exceptional students from non-elite families might occasionally gain scribal training through temple schools or private arrangements, providing limited social mobility. The emphasis on practical education meant most Mesopotamians remained illiterate, relying on professional scribes for legal documents and correspondence. The scribal schools, called tablet houses, provided rigorous training that went far beyond simple literacy. Students began by copying basic cuneiform signs repeatedly until muscle memory ensured consistent formation. They progressed to copying word lists, then simple sentences, and eventually complex literary texts. Mathematics, accounting, and legal formulas formed essential parts of the curriculum. Advanced students studied Sumerian, by then a dead language, as Latin would be studied in medieval Europe. The harsh discipline reportedly included beating for errors, though some texts suggest affectionate relationships between masters and successful students. The daily routine of a scribal school began before dawn, with students preparing clay tablets for the day's exercises. Morning sessions focused on copying new material under direct supervision, with masters correcting errors and demonstrating proper technique. Afternoon periods might involve memorization, recitation, or solving mathematical problems. Students who mastered basic literacy might specialize in particular fields such as medicine, astronomy, or temple administration. The intellectual culture of these schools preserved and transmitted Mesopotamian knowledge while generating new insights through commentary and compilation. Medical practice in Mesopotamia combined empirical observation with spiritual intervention in ways that seemed natural to practitioners who saw illness as potentially resulting from divine displeasure, demonic attack, or physical imbalance. Two types of healers served the population: the physician who prescribed medications and performed procedures, and the exorcist who conducted rituals to expel disease-causing demons. These specialists often worked together, recognizing that successful treatment might require addressing both physical symptoms and spiritual causes. The diagnostic handbooks that guided medical practice reveal systematic approaches to identifying and treating disease. Physicians examine patients carefully, noting symptoms including fever patterns, skin color changes, and bodily discharges. Prognoses estimated recovery chances based on symptom combinations, with remarkable accuracy in predicting outcomes for certain conditions. Treatments ranged from herbal preparations and dietary prescriptions to surgical procedures including wound suturing, abscess drainage, and even eye cataract operations. The pharmacopoeia included hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral substances, many with genuine therapeutic properties recognized by modern medicine. Preventive medicine received considerable attention, with recommendations for diet, exercise, and hygiene that demonstrate understanding of health maintenance. Public health measures included regulations about waste disposal, water source protection, and isolation of certain infectious diseases. The association between marshy areas and fever, though not understanding mosquito transmission, led to practical recommendations about residence location. Personal hygiene practices, including regular bathing, hair care, and dental cleaning, were promoted for both health and social acceptability. The Mesopotamian diet varied by season, social class, and geographic location, but centered on barley as the fundamental staple. Barley served multiple purposes: ground into flour for flatbreads, cooked as porridge, and most importantly, brewed into beer that provided both nutrition and safe hydration in a world where water quality remained uncertain. Wheat, more expensive and difficult to grow, was reserved for special occasions and elite consumption. Date palms provided not only fruit but also sap for syrup, fronds for basketry, and wood for construction, making them invaluable multi-purpose resources. Beer brewing was so fundamental to Mesopotamian life that numerous deities governed its production and consumption. Professional brewers, often women, produced various types distinguished by ingredients, strength, and filtering methods. Taverns served as social centers where people gathered to drink, eat, conduct business, and exchange news. The Code of Hammurabi regulated tavern operations, specifying fair measures and prohibiting certain gatherings that might threaten public order. Beer consumption occurred at all social levels, from slaves receiving daily rations to elaborate royal banquets featuring specially crafted brews. Meat consumption depended heavily on economic status, with most people eating it only during festivals or special occasions. Sheep and goats provided the most common meat, with cattle reserved for wealthy households and temple sacrifices. Pigs, though raised in certain periods and regions, faced religious restrictions that limited their consumption. Wild game, including deer, gazelles, and birds, supplemented diets where hunting was possible. Fish from rivers and marshes provided protein for communities with access to water resources, preserved through salting, drying, or pickling for longer storage. Vegetables and legumes added variety and nutrition to grain-based diets. Onions, garlic, and leeks appeared in virtually every meal, providing flavor and presumed medicinal benefits. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans offered protein alternatives to meat. Lettuce, cucumbers, and melons provided fresh foods during growing seasons. Herbs and spices, including cumin, coriander, and mustard enhanced flavors while serving medicinal purposes. The combination of ingredients in surviving recipes reveals sophisticated understanding of complementary flavors and nutritional balance. Food preparation required considerable time and skill, with most households dedicating significant labor to daily meal production. Grinding grain on stone querns, a task usually performed by women, might require hours of work to produce enough flour for family bread. Cooking facilities ranged from simple hearths to elaborate kitchen complexes in wealthy households with specialized equipment for different preparations. Fermentation techniques produced not only beer, but also pickled vegetables, preserved dairy products, and leavened breads that added variety to diets. The textile industry employed more people than any other craft, with production occurring at every social level, from individual households to temple workshops employing thousands. Wool from sheep formed the primary fiber, though linen from flax was produced in certain regions. The transformation of raw wool into finished cloth required multiple stages, including cleaning, combing, spinning, dyeing, weaving, and finishing. Each stage demanded specific skills and tools, creating specialized occupations within the broader textile industry. Women dominated textile production, though men participated in certain aspects, including dyeing and finishing processes. Girls learned spinning from early childhood, developing the hand coordination necessary to produce consistent thread. Professional weavers operated complex looms capable of producing elaborate patterns and multiple cloth grades. The finest textiles incorporated colored threads, metallic elements, and complex weaves that created garments worthy of divine statues and royal wardrobes. Textile production provided economic independence for many women who could sell their products in markets or to merchants. Mesopotamian craftsmen achieved remarkable sophistication in metalworking, creating objects that combined utilitarian function with artistic beauty. Copper and bronze dominated most periods, with techniques including casting, hammering, annealing, and joining. The lost wax casting method enabled production of complex shapes, impossible to achieve through other means. Decorative techniques including engraving, repoussé, and inlay created elaborate surface ornamentations. Gold and silver work reached extraordinary refinement, with granulation and filigree techniques producing jewelry that rivals modern craftsmanship. Pottery production evolved from household craft to industrial manufacture, with specialized workshops producing standardized vessels for mass markets. The potter's wheel revolutionized production speed and uniformity, while improved kilns enabled higher firing temperatures that produced stronger, more waterproof ceramics. Glazing techniques, developed primarily for architectural applications, were also applied to special vessels. The decoration of pottery ranged from simple incisions to elaborate painted scenes, with styles varying by period and region, but maintaining distinctive Mesopotamian characteristics. Slavery existed throughout Mesopotamian history, but functioned differently from later plantation systems. Most slaves were war captives or defaulted debtors rather than hereditary chattels. They retained certain legal rights, could own property, operate businesses, and purchase their freedom. Temple and palace slaves often lived much like free workers, receiving rations, housing, and sometimes plots of land to cultivate. Household slaves might be treated as inferior family members, with manumission common through adoption or testament. The boundaries between free, dependent, and slave status were more fluid than rigid, with individuals potentially moving between categories. The labor system more broadly included various forms of dependent and semi-free workers who were neither slaves nor fully independent. The Mushkanum class occupied an intermediate position, working royal or temple lands in exchange for subsistence and protection. Corvée labor obligations required free citizens to contribute work on public projects including canal maintenance, wall construction, and military service. These labor arrangements created complex social hierarchies where freedom existed in degrees rather than absolutes. Festivals punctuated the Mesopotamian calendar, providing respites from daily labor and opportunities for communal celebration. Religious festivals honored specific deities with processions, sacrifices, and ritual dramas that reenacted mythological events. The New Year festival, lasting up to 12 days, involved entire populations in ceremonies ensuring cosmic renewal and agricultural fertility. Harvest festivals celebrated successful crops with feasting, music, and dance. These occasions reinforced social bonds while allowing temporary relaxation of normal hierarchies as people joined in collective joy. Entertainment took various forms from simple storytelling to elaborate performances. Professional musicians played at religious ceremonies, royal courts, and private celebrations, with instruments including harps, lyres, drums, flutes, and cymbals. Dancers, often associated with temple cults, performed both sacred and secular pieces. Acrobats, jugglers, and animal trainers provided spectacle at major gatherings. Board games, including the game of 20 squares, offered intellectual competition, with elaborate sets indicating the importance placed on strategic gaming. Wrestling and other athletic contests provided both entertainment and opportunities for young men to demonstrate physical prowess. The tavern served as the primary social institution outside family and temple, where people of various classes might interact relatively freely. These establishments offered not just beer and food, but also music, games, and conversation. Business deals were negotiated over drinks, travelers exchanged news from distant places, and workers relaxed after long days. Tavern keepers, frequently women, extended credit, held valuables for safekeeping, and sometimes provided lodging. The social mixing that occurred in taverns concerned authorities who periodically attempted to regulate gatherings that might foster sedition. Personal grooming and appearance mattered significantly in Mesopotamian society, with elaborate attention paid to hairstyles, cosmetics, and clothing. Hair arrangements indicated social status, occupation, and sometimes religious affiliation. Both men and women used cosmetics, including kohl for eyes, henna for skin decoration, and various oils and perfumes. Clothing styles varied by period but generally involved draped garments for both sexes, with quality of fabric and decoration indicating wealth. Jewelry served both ornamental and protective functions, with amulets warding off evil while displaying prosperity. Death and burial practices reflected beliefs about afterlife and social obligations to deceased family members. The dying received ritual attention including final confessions, blessings, and arrangements for inheritance distribution. Bodies were washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in grave clothes appropriate to status. Burial typically occurred quickly due to climate, with interment in family tombs, cemeteries, or beneath house floors. Grave goods ranging from simple pottery to elaborate treasures accompanied the dead, providing for afterlife needs while demonstrating family wealth and affection. Mourning rituals involved prescribed periods of lamentation, with professional mourners sometimes hired to ensure proper observance. Memorial offerings at graves continued indefinitely, with families providing food, drink, and prayers for deceased members. The Kispu ceremony united living and dead family members in ritual meals that maintained kinship bonds across the boundary of death. Neglect of these obligations was believed to cause restless spirits to trouble the living, making ancestor cult maintenance a serious responsibility that shaped inheritance practices and family dynamics. Urban planning in Mesopotamian cities revealed sophisticated understanding of public health, traffic flow, and social organization. Streets followed rough grids in planned sections, with major thoroughfares wide enough for wheeled traffic and smaller alleys providing neighborhood access. Drainage systems carried rainwater and waste away from inhabited areas, though maintenance challenges created recurring sanitation problems. Public spaces, including markets, squares, and temple courtyards, provided venues for commercial, social, and religious activities. Zoning of activities concentrated related crafts in specific quarters, facilitating production while containing industrial nuisances. Housing ranged from single-room dwellings to elaborate multi-story mansions, but the courtyard house represented the ideal for those who could afford it. These inward-facing structures provided privacy, security, and climate control, with rooms arranged around central courts that supplied light and air. Ground floors typically contained public spaces, storage, and sometimes commercial areas, while upper floors housed private family quarters. Flat roofs served as additional living space, particularly for sleeping during hot summer nights. Construction materials varied by availability and wealth, from simple mud brick to fired brick and imported stone for elite residences. The religious imagination of Mesopotamia created a cosmos teeming with divine beings whose personalities, conflicts, and relationships mirrored the complexities of human society while transcending mortal limitations. These gods and goddesses were not distant abstractions but immediate presences who dwelt in temple statues, spoke through omens, and intervened constantly in human affairs. The evolution of this divine pantheon across 4 millennia reveals not static tradition, but dynamic theological creativity as successive cultures reinterpreted ancient deities to address contemporary concerns and legitimize political arrangements. The earliest Mesopotamian gods emerged from the forces of nature that dominated agricultural society. Anu, the distant sky father, reigned nominally over the pantheon but remained aloof from human concerns, delegating active governance to more engaged deities. Enlil, master of winds and storms, exercised practical sovereignty as the god who decreed fates and toppled kingdoms. Enki, lord of the underground freshwater ocean, provided wisdom, crafts, and the civilizing arts that distinguished humans from beasts. These 3 great gods formed a cosmic executive, making decisions that affected both divine and mortal realms through formal assemblies that followed protocols resembling Mesopotamian political institutions. The goddess Inanna, known to the Akkadians as Ishtar, embodied contradictions that reflected ancient anxieties about female power and sexuality. She was, simultaneously, the nurturing goddess of love who brought fertility and the terrible goddess of war who delighted in battle. Her dual nature manifested in myths where she could shower blessings upon favorites while destroying those who spurned her advances. The story of her descent to the underworld, where she was stripped of power and killed before being resurrected, encoded profound insights about the cyclical nature of life, the necessity of death for renewal, and the limits even divine beings faced when transgressing cosmic boundaries. The process of theological syncretism continuously reshaped the pantheon as different peoples contributed their deities to the collective divine assembly. When the Amorites established dynasties throughout Mesopotamia, their tribal gods were integrated into existing pantheons, often through identification with established deities or genealogical incorporation as children or spouses. Marduk's rise from obscure local deity to supreme god paralleled Babylon's political ascendance, demonstrating how theology served political ideology. Yet this process was not simply cynical manipulation, as genuine religious experiences and evolving spiritual insights shaped theological development. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, represented the mature expression of Mesopotamian cosmological thought while serving immediate political purposes. The narrative begins with primordial chaos, personified as Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, and Apsu, the freshwater deep, whose mingling generated the first gods. These younger deities disturbed their parents' rest with their noise and activity, leading Apsu to plot their destruction. He, the clever god, killed Apsu preemptively, but Tiamat, roused to terrible vengeance, created an army of monsters to destroy the younger gods. The divine assembly, terrified of Tiamat's power, turned to Marduk, offering him supreme authority if he could defeat the primordial mother. Marduk's victory, achieved through superior weapons and strategic intelligence rather than brute force, established principles of cosmic order that legitimized hierarchical authority and technological progress. From Tiamat's corpse, Marduk fashioned the universe, splitting her body to create heaven and earth, using her blood to form rivers, and establishing celestial bodies in their courses. This creative violence, transforming chaotic matter into ordered cosmos, provided mythological justification for imperial conquest, presented as bringing civilization to barbarous lands. The creation of humanity in the Enuma Elish addressed fundamental questions about human purpose and destiny. The gods, wearied by the labor of maintaining the universe, desired servants to assume these burdens. Marduk, with Ea's assistance, killed Chingu, Tiamat's general, and from his blood, mixed with clay, created humanity. This origin story established humans as beings created specifically to serve the gods, bearing divine essence through Chingu's blood, yet fashioned for servitude. The tension between divine nature and servile function would reverberate through subsequent religious traditions, influencing concepts of human dignity and purpose. Alternative creation traditions preserve different perspectives on cosmic and human origins. The Atrahasis epic presented humans as created to relieve the lesser gods from agricultural labor, but their proliferation and noise disturbed divine rest, leading to repeated attempts at population reduction through plague, famine, and flood. These stories encoded ecological wisdom about resource limitations and population pressure, while exploring theological questions about divine justice and human suffering. The preservation of multiple creation accounts demonstrates Mesopotamian tolerance for theological diversity, rather than insistence on single orthodox narratives. Afterlife beliefs in Mesopotamia presented a notably pessimistic vision that contrasted sharply with Egyptian concepts of blessed immortality. The netherworld, ruled by Ereshkigal and her consort Nergal, was conceived as a dark, dusty realm where all dead, regardless of earthly status or moral behavior, existed as insubstantial shadows. The dead consumed dust and clay, wore feathers like birds, and dwelt in darkness relieved only by the occasional offerings from living descendants. This grim prospect motivated focus on earthly achievement and descendant memory rather than hope for posthumous reward. The Epic of Gilgamesh confronted mortality's inevitability with profound psychological insight and philosophical sophistication. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality, after his friend Enkidu's death, led him through progressively disillusioning encounters that revealed the futility of escaping human fate. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted immortality, demonstrated that his eternal life resulted from unrepeatable divine caprice rather than achievable human effort. The plant of youth, obtained through tremendous effort, was stolen by a serpent, suggesting that renewal belonged to nature rather than individual humans. Gilgamesh's final acceptance of mortality, finding meaning in cultural achievements that outlast individual life, articulated a humanistic response to existential anxiety. The boundary between life and death remained permeable in Mesopotamian thought, with various categories of spirits mediating between realms. The Atemu, ghosts of the dead, could return to trouble the living if proper burial rites were neglected or offerings discontinued. Necromancy, the consultation of the dead for information, appeared in texts like Gilgamesh's summoning of Enkidu's spirit, though such practices were viewed ambivalently. The goddess Lamashtu, who died in childbirth and became a demon threatening pregnant women and infants, exemplified beings who crossed the death boundary with malevolent intent. Divination permeated Mesopotamian religion as the primary means of discerning divine will and anticipating future events. The gods communicated through myriad channels, from the entrails of sacrificed animals to the patterns of oil on water, from celestial movements to malformed births. Professional diviners developed elaborate interpretive systems that transformed random phenomena into meaningful messages. This was not primitive superstition, but a sophisticated attempt to find pattern and meaning in a universe where divine forces constantly influenced human affairs. Extispicy, the examination of animal entrails, particularly sheep livers, became the most prestigious form of divination. Diviners underwent extensive training to recognize significant features and interpret their combinations. Clay models of livers with inscribed interpretations served as teaching tools and reference works. The practice required not just technical knowledge but also rhetorical skill to frame predictions diplomatically, particularly when delivering unwelcome news to powerful patrons. The tension between technical expertise and political pressure created ethical dilemmas familiar to modern technical advisors. Astronomical observation served divinatory purposes long before developing into mathematical astronomy. Celestial omens linked planetary positions, lunar phases, and unusual phenomena like eclipses or comets to terrestrial events. The regular movements of celestial bodies suggested divine order and predictability, while irregularities signaled divine intervention, requiring human response. The compilation of thousands of celestial omens in series like Enuma Anu Enlil created reference works that guided royal decision-making for centuries. These observations generated the data sets that eventually enabled mathematical astronomy, demonstrating how religious practices could generate scientific knowledge. Dreams provided another channel for divine communication, though their interpretation required specialized knowledge to distinguish meaningful visions from meaningless phantasms. Dream interpretation manuals catalogued thousands of scenarios with their supposed significance, creating systematic approaches to unconscious imagery. Royal dreams received particular attention, as the gods were believed to communicate directly with kings about matters of state. The practice of incubation, sleeping in temples to receive divine dreams, allowed ordinary people to seek divine guidance for personal problems. Temple economies formed the backbone of Mesopotamian economic life for millennia, with religious institutions controlling vast resources and coordinating complex production systems. Temples owned agricultural estates worked by dependent laborers, operated workshops producing textiles and other goods, and managed long-distance trade networks. The redistribution of offerings through temple personnel created social welfare systems while reinforcing hierarchical relationships. Temple archives preserve millions of economic documents that reveal sophisticated accounting, management, and financial practices. The financing of temple operations required diverse revenue streams beyond agricultural production. Dedications from wealthy patrons, often in exchange for prayers or commemorative inscriptions, provided capital for construction projects. Temple prostitution, whether sacred or commercial, generated income while serving religious functions related to fertility cults. Money lending at interest, justified as generating returns for divine estates, made temples major financial institutions. The tension between religious ideals and economic necessities created theological debates about appropriate temple activities. The relationship between temples and political authorities evolved continuously, with periods of cooperation, competition, and conflict. Kings portrayed themselves as temple builders and divine servants, while seeking to control temple resources for state purposes. High priests wielded enormous influence through their control of religious legitimation and economic resources. The balance between religious and secular authority shifted repeatedly, with neither achieving permanent dominance. This dynamic tension created spaces for negotiation and resistance that prevented total autocracy. Personal piety in Mesopotamia extended far beyond formal temple rituals to encompass intimate relationships between individuals and their patron deities. Personal gods served as divine advocates who interceded with higher deities on behalf of their human clients. These relationships resembled patron-client bonds in human society, with mutual obligations and expectations. Individuals made votive offerings, observed food taboos, and performed private rituals to maintain divine favor. Personal names incorporating divine elements expressed parental hopes and family religious commitments. The use of amulets, incantations, and protective figurines reveals widespread concern about malevolent supernatural forces. Demons, conceived as beings intermediate between gods and humans, caused illness, misfortune, and death. Elaborate rituals of exorcism combine prayers, offerings, and symbolic actions to expel demonic influences. The burial of protective figurines beneath thresholds and the wearing of amulets inscribed with protective formulas demonstrate that supernatural threats were considered immediate and constant. These practices reveal existential anxieties about vulnerability and the limits of human agency in controlling fate. Magical practices occupied an ambiguous position between legitimate religion and dangerous sorcery. Beneficial magic, including healing rituals and protective spells, was generally accepted and often performed by temple personnel. Malevolent magic, aimed at harming others, was condemned and sometimes punished by death. The distinction between acceptable and unacceptable magic often depended on practitioner status and social context, rather than clear theological principles. This ambiguity created spaces for alternative religious practices that served those marginalized by official cults. The influence of Mesopotamian religion on subsequent traditions can hardly be overstated. Hebrew Bible narratives, including creation, flood, and tower stories, show clear Mesopotamian influence while transforming polytheistic myths into monotheistic theology. The figure of Satan as cosmic adversary derives partly from Mesopotamian combat myths between order and chaos. Angels as divine messengers and heavenly bureaucrats reflect Mesopotamian concepts of lesser deities serving supreme gods. Wisdom literature traditions, apocalyptic imagery, and cosmological structures passed through multiple cultural filters from Mesopotamia to influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Greek mythology absorbed numerous Mesopotamian elements through cultural contact during the Bronze Age and later periods. The succession myth of Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus parallels Mesopotamian traditions of generational conflict among gods. Aphrodite's characteristics echo Ishtar's dual nature as love and war goddess. The hero's journey pattern exemplified in Gilgamesh influenced Greek epic traditions. Mystery religions promising salvation incorporated Mesopotamian themes of dying and rising gods. These transmissions were not simple borrowings but creative adaptations that transformed Mesopotamian materials for new cultural contexts. Persian Zoroastrianism, despite its distinctive monotheistic tendencies, incorporated Mesopotamian elements, including cosmic dualism, angelology, and apocalyptic expectations. The Zoroastrian concept of history moving toward a final renovation, where good triumphs over evil, adapted Mesopotamian combat myths into ethical philosophy. The elaborate geography of heaven and hell in Zoroastrian texts shows Mesopotamian influence while developing distinctive soteriological innovations. These Persian adaptations subsequently influenced Judaism during and after the Babylonian exile, creating complex networks of religious transmission. Astronomical astrology, developed in Mesopotamia as a divinatory practice, spread throughout the ancient world and persists in modern popular culture. The zodiac, planetary associations, and horoscopic techniques originated in Babylonian temples before being adopted by Greeks, Indians, and Arabs. While scientific astronomy diverged from astrological practice, the cultural impact of Mesopotamian celestial divination continues to influence how many people understand personality, destiny, and cosmic influence. The persistence of these ideas demonstrates the powerful appeal of finding meaning in celestial patterns. The Mesopotamian understanding of law as divinely ordained rather than humanly constructed influenced subsequent legal traditions throughout the Near East and beyond. The concept of written law codes as divine revelations exemplified in Hammurabi's reception of laws from Shamash, established patterns followed in biblical and Islamic legal traditions. The principle of proportional justice, encoded in eye for an eye formulations, spread from Mesopotamian law through biblical texts into Western legal philosophy. The combination of apodictic and casuistic law, mixing absolute principles with case-based examples, created flexible frameworks for addressing diverse situations. Sacred kingship concepts developed in Mesopotamia influenced political theology throughout the ancient world and beyond. The king as divine representative, shepherd of the people, and maintainer of cosmic order provided templates for royal ideology from Egypt to India. The ritual humiliation and renewal of kings during New Year festivals influenced concepts of servant leadership and sacrificial kingship. The tension between divine mandate and royal accountability, explored in Mesopotamian texts, resonated in political philosophies that sought to limit autocratic power while maintaining hierarchical order. Temple architectural forms pioneered in Mesopotamia spread throughout the ancient world, influencing sacred architecture from Egypt to Greece. The ziggurat as artificial mountain connecting earth and heaven inspired temple platforms and stepped pyramids across cultures. The sequence of increasingly sacred spaces from public courtyards to restricted sanctuaries established patterns followed in Jerusalem's temple and subsequent religious architecture. The orientation of temples according to celestial alignments and the incorporation of cosmic symbolism in architectural decoration created models for sacred space that transcended specific religious traditions. The entry of Cyrus the Great into Babylon in 539 BCE marked not violent destruction, but peaceful transition, as the Persian conqueror presented himself as liberator rather than foreign invader. His famous cylinder, discovered in the 19th century and sometimes called history's first charter of human rights, proclaimed religious tolerance, repatriation of exiled peoples, and respect for local traditions. The Jewish exiles' return to Jerusalem, authorized by Cyrus, fulfilled prophetic expectations while demonstrating pragmatic Persian policies of ruling through local elites and traditional institutions rather than imposing alien systems. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia became the wealthiest satrapy of an empire stretching from India to Greece, continuing its ancient role as economic heartland and cultural center. Babylon retained special status as one of the empire's capitals, where Persian kings performed traditional Mesopotamian rituals, including the New Year festival. Cuneiform scribes continued copying ancient texts, astronomers maintained their observations, and temples preserved religious traditions. Yet subtle changes were occurring as Aramaic replaced Akkadian in daily speech, Persian administrative practices influenced governance, and Zoroastrian ideas began percolating through Mesopotamian thought. The Babylonian astronomical schools achieved their greatest scientific accomplishments under Persian and subsequent Hellenistic rule, developing mathematical models of planetary motion that would not be surpassed until the scientific revolution. The astronomer Kidinnu calculated the length of the solar year with an accuracy of less than 5 minutes deviation from modern measurements. Nabu-Rimani developed theories of lunar motion that influenced Hipparchus and, through him, Ptolemy's Almagest. These achievements represented pure mathematical astronomy, divorced from the astrological divination that had originally motivated celestial observation. Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire in 331 BCE brought Hellenistic influence to Mesopotamia, while simultaneously exposing Greeks to millennia of accumulated Eastern wisdom. Alexander, declaring himself the successor of Babylonian kings, planned to make Babylon his eastern capital and ordered the restoration of temples, including the Great Ziggurat. His premature death in Nebuchadnezzar's palace in 323 BCE prevented these plans' fulfillment, but the Seleucid dynasty that inherited Mesopotamia continued Hellenistic Babylonian cultural synthesis. The Seleucid period witnessed remarkable cultural hybridization, As Greek colonists settled in new cities like Seleucia on the Tigris, while ancient centers maintained traditional practices. Berossus, a Babylonian priest, wrote his Babylonica in Greek, transmitting Mesopotamian historical and mythological traditions to the Hellenistic world. Greek astronomical texts incorporated Babylonian observations and computational methods. The syncretistic religious movements that flourished in this environment combined Mesopotamian, Greek, and Persian elements, creating mystery cults and philosophical schools that would influence late antique spirituality. The gradual decline of cuneiform literacy marked the slow death of a 3,000-year tradition. By the 1st century CE, only a few temple schools maintained the knowledge necessary to read the ancient script. The last dated cuneiform tablet, an astronomical almanac from 75 CE, represents the end of history's longest-lasting writing tradition. As cuneiform disappeared, vast libraries of accumulated wisdom became indecipherable, awaiting rediscovery by future scholars. The oral traditions and folk memories that preserved fragments of Mesopotamian culture were gradually absorbed into the dominant Aramaic, Persian, and eventually Arabic cultural streams. The Parthian and Sasanian periods saw Mesopotamia contested between Persian empires and Rome, with devastating consequences for urban centers and irrigation systems. The great cities that had flourished for millennia contracted or were abandoned entirely. Babylon, once the world's greatest metropolis, dwindled to a village squatting among ancient ruins. The Jewish Talmudic academies at Sura and Pumbedita preserved some Mesopotamian legal and intellectual traditions, incorporating them into rabbinic literature that would influence Jewish thought for centuries. The Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia in 637 CE brought new life to the region, while severing most remaining connections to its ancient past. Baghdad, founded in 762 CE near the ruins of Babylon, and Ctesiphon became the Abbasid Caliphate's capital and briefly the Islamic world's intellectual center. The House of Wisdom, established by Caliph al-Ma'mun, translated and preserved Greek and Persian texts, some containing fragments of Mesopotamian knowledge transmitted through intermediate cultures. Islamic astronomers built upon Babylonian observations. Islamic law incorporated Mesopotamian precedents through Persian and Jewish intermediaries, and Islamic architecture adapted Mesopotamian techniques of vault and dome construction. Medieval Islamic and Jewish scholars preserved garbled memories of Mesopotamian civilization in chronicles mixing history with legend. The Tower of Babel story from Genesis shaped understanding of Babylon as a symbol of human pride and divine judgment. The figure of Abraham, traditionally associated with Ur, connected monotheistic traditions to Mesopotamian origins. Medieval travelers occasionally reported vast ruins in Iraq, but their accounts were dismissed as exaggerations or interpreted through biblical rather than historical frameworks. The European rediscovery of ancient Mesopotamia began with Renaissance humanists studying classical sources that mentioned Babylon and Assyria. The accounts of Herodotus, Xenophon, and other Greek historians provided tantalizing glimpses of vanished civilizations. Pietro della Valle, visiting Mesopotamia in 1616, brought back to Europe the first cuneiform inscriptions, though no one could read them. Subsequent travelers, including Carsten Niebuhr in the 18th century, made accurate copies of inscriptions that would prove crucial for decipherment efforts. The 19th century witnessed an explosion of interest in Mesopotamian archaeology, driven by biblical scholarship, imperial competition, and romantic fascination with lost civilizations. Paul-Émile Botta's excavations at Khorsabad in 1843 uncovered the palace of Sargon II, revealing Assyrian art of stunning power and sophistication. Austin. Henry Layard's discoveries at Nimrud and Nineveh, including the library of Ashurbanipal, captured public imagination while providing texts that would revolutionize understanding of ancient history. The transport of monumental sculptures to European museums, though controversial by modern standards, made Mesopotamian art accessible to millions while inspiring further research. The decipherment of cuneiform ranks among the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century, comparable to the decoding of Egyptian hieroglyphics or the theory of evolution. Georg Friedrich Grotefend made initial breakthroughs by identifying Persian royal names in trilingual inscriptions. Henry Rawlinson's copying of the massive Behistun inscription carved on a cliff face in Iran provided the key to understanding Old Persian cuneiform. From Persian, scholars worked backward to decipher Akkadian and eventually Sumerian, revealing entire civilizations lost to human memory. The recovery of Mesopotamian literature profoundly impacted Western culture and scholarship. George Smith's 1872 discovery of the flood tablet from Gilgamesh, paralleling the biblical deluge, created sensation and controversy about the relationship between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. The publication of creation myths, law codes, and wisdom literature revealed that many ideas considered unique to biblical tradition had ancient Mesopotamian precedents. This knowledge forced reconsideration of cultural origins and the development of civilization. Archaeological methods evolved dramatically from treasure hunting to scientific excavation as scholars recognized that contexts and everyday objects could reveal more about ancient life than spectacular artifacts. German excavations at Babylon under Robert Koldewey pioneered systematic techniques including architectural recording and ceramic analysis. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s and 1930s, revealing the royal cemetery's treasures, demonstrated how careful excavation could reconstruct ancient societies. The University of Chicago's Oriental Institute expeditions established standards for recording and publication that influenced archaeological practice worldwide. The decipherment of Sumerian in the early 20th century revealed humanity's first literate civilization, pushing back the horizons of recorded history by 2 millennia. Scholars like Arno Pobel, Thorkild Jacobsen, and Samuel Noah Kramer reconstructed Sumerian grammar, translated literary texts, and revealed a culture of extraordinary sophistication that predated all known civilizations. The discovery that Sumerians were linguistically unrelated to surrounding peoples raised questions about cultural origins and transmission that remain debated today. The interpretation of Mesopotamian economic texts revolutionized understanding of ancient economies and the origins of capitalism. Thousands of old Babylonian contracts revealed sophisticated financial instruments, including loans, partnerships, and letters of credit. The Murashu archive from Persian period, Nippur, documented complex banking operations. These discoveries challenged assumptions about primitive economies and demonstrated that market mechanisms operated alongside state and temple institutions. Economic historians found in Mesopotamia evidence for both market economics and state socialism, fueling ongoing debates about economic organization. Modern understanding of mathematics and astronomy owes significant debts to Mesopotamian pioneers whose achievements were recovered through patient archaeological and philological work. Mathematical texts revealed that Babylonians understood the Pythagorean theorem 1500 years before Pythagoras, solved quadratic equations, and calculated square roots with remarkable accuracy. Astronomical texts demonstrated systematic observation, mathematical modeling, and theoretical sophistication that influenced all subsequent astronomy through Greek and Arabic transmission. The recovery of Mesopotamian medicine challenged narratives of medical history that began with Hippocrates. Medical texts revealed systematic diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment 2,000 years before Greek medicine. Surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and understanding of contagion appeared in cuneiform texts. While magical elements persisted alongside empirical observations, the sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and pathology demonstrated that scientific medicine had deep roots in Mesopotamian practice. Contemporary conflicts and political instabilities have both threatened Mesopotamian heritage and occasionally revealed new discoveries. The Gulf Wars and subsequent occupation exposed archaeological sites to looting that dispersed artifacts through illegal antiquities markets. The Islamic State's deliberate destruction of Palmyra, Nimrud, and other sites represented cultural genocide aimed at erasing pre-Islamic heritage. Yet satellite archaeology has revealed thousands of previously unknown sites, while digital humanities projects make cuneiform texts accessible worldwide through online databases. The ongoing publication and translation of cuneiform texts continues revealing new aspects of Mesopotamian civilization. Hundreds of thousands of tablets remain unpublished in museum collections, awaiting study. Each year brings discoveries that modify understanding of Mesopotamian history, literature, and culture. Recent finds include new fragments of the Gilgamesh epic, mathematical texts revealing unknown computational methods, and administrative archives documenting previously unknown rulers and events. Modern Iraq preserves living traditions that connect to its ancient past, though often transformed beyond recognition. The mudhif reed houses of the marsh Arabs use construction techniques depicted on 5,000-year-old Sumerian seals. Agricultural practices in some rural areas maintain patterns established in antiquity. Place names preserve ancient toponyms with modern Hit corresponding to ancient Id and Erbil to ancient Arbela. These continuities, though fragmentary, demonstrate that Mesopotamian civilization's influence persists in its homeland despite millennia of cultural change. The influence of Mesopotamian innovations on contemporary life extends far beyond historical curiosity. The 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, and the 7-day week originated in Mesopotamian mathematics and astronomy. Legal principles, including written contracts, witnessed testimony, and proportional justice, trace back to Mesopotamian law codes. Urban planning concepts, including zoning, drainage systems, and public spaces, were pioneered in Mesopotamian cities. Agricultural techniques, including irrigation, crop rotation, and selective breeding, began in Mesopotamian fields. Literary patterns established in Mesopotamian texts continue influencing world literature. The hero's journey exemplified in Gilgamesh appears in stories from Homer to Harry Potter. The flood narrative resonates across cultures from Noah to Deucalion to Manu. Wisdom literature traditions preserved in Ludlul Bel Nemeki and other texts established genres that flourished in biblical proverbs and Ecclesiastes. The psychological realism of Mesopotamian literature, exploring themes of friendship, mortality, and meaning, speaks to contemporary readers across cultural and temporal distances. Religious concepts originating in Mesopotamia permeate contemporary spirituality even among those unaware of their origins. The cosmic battle between order and chaos, divine judgment after death, and messianic redemption draw on Mesopotamian mythological patterns. Angels and demons as supernatural intermediaries derive partly from Mesopotamian precedents. The concept of scripture as divine revelation recorded in writing originated with Mesopotamian claims of divine authorship for law codes and religious texts. These influences, filtered through multiple religious traditions, shape how billions understand sacred reality. Educational practices pioneered in Mesopotamian scribal schools established patterns still followed in contemporary education. The progression from basic literacy to specialized professional training, the use of standard texts and exercises, and the combination of theoretical knowledge with practical application originated in tablet houses. The concept of preserving knowledge in libraries, organizing information systematically, and transmitting learning across generations through educational institutions began in Mesopotamian temples. These foundations of formal education, though transformed by successive innovations, maintain structural continuities with their ancient origins. The questions that Mesopotamian thinkers posed about justice, meaning, suffering, and human destiny remain central to philosophy and theology. Their struggles to reconcile divine justice with human suffering, explored in texts like the Babylonian Theodicy, anticipate discussions from Job through Voltaire to contemporary philosophy of religion. Their efforts to find meaning in mortality, expressed powerfully in Gilgamesh, resonate with existentialist philosophy and contemporary psychology. Their attempts to create just societies through law, administration, and ethical reflection provide both positive examples and cautionary tales for contemporary political thought. Modern environmental challenges echo problems that contributed to Mesopotamian civilization's decline. Soil salinization from intensive irrigation, deforestation from urban expansion, and climate change impacts on agriculture plagued ancient Mesopotamians as they plague contemporary societies. The collapse of cities that flourished for millennia demonstrates that environmental degradation can destroy even the most sophisticated civilizations. These historical lessons, recovered through archaeological and textual research, provide urgent warnings about sustainable resource management and environmental protection. The recovery and interpretation of Mesopotamian civilization continues evolving as new methods and perspectives enrich understanding. Digital humanities techniques enable computer-assisted translation and analysis of massive textual corpora. Scientific archaeology employs ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and chemical analysis to reveal invisible aspects of ancient life. Post-colonial perspectives challenge Eurocentric interpretations, while indigenous Middle Eastern scholars reclaim their heritage from Western academic dominance. These developments promise continued revelations about humanity's first civilization. As night falls over the ancient tells of Iraq, where broken pottery and crumbling bricks mark cities that flourished before Abraham, before Moses, before Homer, the legacy of Mesopotamia endures in ways both obvious and subtle. In the accountant's ledger and the astronomer's ephemeris, in the judge's gavel and the poet's metaphor, in the urban planner's grid and the farmer's furrow, the innovations of Sumerian and Babylonian and Assyrian genius continue shaping human experience. The student learning to write, the merchant drafting a contract, the priest performing a ritual, and the philosopher pondering existence all participate in traditions that began between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, when humanity first discovered that marks in clay could preserve thought across time and wisdom could accumulate across generations. The story of Mesopotamia reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, that the mightiest empires crumble to dust, yet human achievement transcends political mortality through cultural transmission. What survives is not power, but knowledge, not conquest, but creation, not the boasts of kings, but the patient work of scribes who preserved the words, astronomers who tracked the stars, and poets who captured the human heart's eternal struggles. In recovering their legacy, we recover part of ourselves, for we are all inheritors of that first great experiment in civilization that began in the land between the rivers, where humanity first wrote its thoughts, codified its laws, and reached toward heaven with towers of mud brick and dreams of transcendence.